Hey guys, tonight we begin with what happened to the ancient Egyptians after death. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The sands of Egypt whisper secrets that have outlasted empires. Imagine standing at the edge of the Nile as the sun dips low, painting the river gold. The air hums with the distant sound of flutes and the chatter of life. But beneath this rhythm of daily existence lies a deeper truth. For every Egyptian, life was only the first chapter. The real journey began after death. To an ancient Egyptian, death was not an end. It was a passage, a crossing from one world into another, from the harsh heat of the living world into the eternal fields of paradise. They believed that when your heart stopped beating, a far more important test awaited. Every peasant, every scribe, every pharaoh would one day stand before the gods to be judged. And so throughout their lives, the Egyptians prepared for that moment with the same care they gave to breathing itself. Let's step back thousands of years into the heart of Thebes. The pyramids may rise far to the north, but here, in the bustling cities of the New Kingdom, death is a familiar companion. People carve tombs in limestone hillsides, wrap amulets in linen, and whisper prayers to Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Even the poorest Egyptian dreams of reaching the field of reeds, a place where the soul could live forever in joy, ploughing green fields under a gentle sun. But that dream comes at a price: preparation, ritual, and moral purity. The belief system that shaped these preparations was intricate. Egyptians believed that every human had multiple parts, not just a body and soul, but a collection of spiritual forces. The Ka was your life force, the energy that lived within you and needed sustenance even after death. The Ba was your personality, a bird-like spirit that could travel between the worlds of the living and the dead. The Ren was your name, your identity. If it was forgotten, your existence would crumble. And above all, the Ak was the transfigured spirit, the union of all these parts in eternal form. For this reason, Egyptians feared being forgotten more than death itself. To lose your name was to die a second final death. This fear shaped their entire civilization, the monuments, the inscriptions, the careful preservation of corpses. Every tomb was a statement against oblivion. Now picture a small, flickering oil lamp inside a workshop in Thebes. The smell of resin and incense hangs in the air. Men in linen skirts work carefully over a body laid on a wooden table. The process of mummification was sacred, complex, and precise. It was not simply about preserving the flesh, but about creating a vessel that the Ka could recognize when it returned. The embalmers began by removing the brain, carefully threading a hooked instrument through the nostrils and extracting the tissue. They didn't understand the brain's modern purpose. To them, the heart was the seat of thought and emotion. The body was then cleaned with palm wine and stuffed with natron salt, a natural preservative drawn from the desert. For 40 days it rested as the moisture was drawn away. When the time came, the embalmers wrapped the body in hundreds of yards of linen, weaving charms and amulets between the layers. Each amulet had meaning: the scarab for rebirth, the eye of Horus for protection, the Djed pillar for strength. When the process was complete, the body was adorned and placed within nested coffins, painted with protective spells. The face on the lid wasn't a portrait. It was a symbol, an idealized vision of what the deceased hoped to be in eternity. But the journey of the soul was only beginning. Egyptians believed that once buried, the dead had to pass through the Duat, the underworld. This was no simple shadow realm. It was a vast, mysterious landscape filled with lakes of fire, gates guarded by serpents, and demons with the heads of crocodiles. To survive this perilous journey, one needed guidance, and that's where the Book of the Dead came in. Despite its name, the Book of the Dead wasn't a single book. It was a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions written on papyrus or painted on tomb walls, tailored to each person's life. It acted as a map through the underworld. Spell 125, for instance, describes the weighing of the heart, one of the most vital moments in the journey after death. In this scene, the deceased stands before Osiris, the green-skinned god of rebirth, seated on his throne, flanked by the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. Thoth, the scribe of the gods, stands ready to record the verdict, while Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, places the heart of the deceased upon a golden scale. On the other side rests a feather, the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth and cosmic balance. If the heart is heavy with sin, it tips the scale, and waiting below is Amit, the devourer, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. The soul of the unworthy is consumed, erased from existence. But if the heart is light, if the person has lived in harmony with Maat, they are welcomed into the eternal paradise of the field of reeds. The Egyptians didn't view this as mere superstition. To them, morality, truth, and justice were part of the natural order. Every lie, every act of cruelty, every injustice weighed down the heart. Living a balanced life, being fair, kind, and respectful to the gods, was a practical matter of survival in eternity. This concept made Egyptian society deeply moralistic. Even the poorest farmer knew the negative confession, a series of declarations recited before judgment. I have not stolen. I have not slain. I have not uttered lies. These weren't commandments carved in stone. They were personal oaths, reminders of how to live rightly. And so, from the humblest mud brick house to the grandest palace, Egyptians built their lives around the promise of what came next. Funerals were not moments of despair, but transitions. The living would feast, sing hymns, and place offerings of bread and flowers at the tomb. Death was the ultimate journey home, but not every Egyptian could afford the lavish tombs we imagine today. While pharaohs were buried in monumental splendor, common people relied on simpler rituals. A loaf of bread, a few words whispered by loved ones. Sometimes that was all they had to ensure a safe passage. Yet in their hearts they believed it was enough. For the gods, they thought, could see sincerity even in poverty. It is this universal faith that gives ancient Egyptian death rituals their haunting beauty. Every detail, from the paintings on the walls to the way the body was wrapped, carried meaning. The tomb itself was seen as a microcosm of the universe, a place where the dead could eat, drink, and sleep, eternally at peace. As night falls over Thebes, the last flickers of lamplight fade. The embalmers step back, their work complete. Tomorrow, priests will lead the funeral procession down to the river, where the coffin will be ferried across the Nile to the western bank, the land of the dead. The mourners will weep, the women will wail, and incense will curl into the night sky like the prayers of the living reaching the gods above. And so, the deceased begins their journey. The world of the living fades behind, and the eternal voyage through the Duat begins. The journey through the Duat begins in silence. The coffin rests deep in the tomb, surrounded by painted walls glowing in the light of flickering lamps. The air is thick with incense, and the last whispers of the living fade away behind sealed stone doors. For the Egyptians, this moment marked the soul's crossing, the instant when the Ka and Ba began their long voyage toward the afterlife. Imagine the darkness of the tomb slowly melting into something else. Not an emptiness, but a realm alive with shadow and light. A place beyond human comprehension. This was the Duat, the underworld, a vast and winding domain said to stretch beneath the earth, mirroring the Nile's path above. It was filled with hidden gates, secret rivers, and guardians who would test the courage and purity of every soul that dared to enter. Each hour of the night brought a new trial. The journey through the Duat was often described in 12 parts, each representing 1 hour of darkness. The sun, god Ra's nightly voyage beneath the horizon. As Ra traveled through this shadow realm in his golden bark, he brought with him the souls of the righteous, guiding them toward the dawn of eternal life. Those who followed him shared his triumph over death, emerging renewed with the sunrise. But for others, those whose hearts were heavy or whose names had been forgotten, the darkness offered no return. In the first gate of the Duat, the deceased would meet the doorkeeper, the herald, and the gate guardian, each with terrifying forms and secret names. The traveler would have to recite the correct words of power to pass. These were not mere passwords, but sacred affirmations of identity and truth. The Book of the Dead provided these incantations, often inscribed directly on the tomb walls or on papyrus scrolls laid within the coffin. To forget them was to be lost forever. Beyond the gates, the Duat unfolded as a series of surreal landscapes. Rivers of fire illuminated the path, and monstrous beings lurked at every bend. Some had the bodies of men and the heads of serpents, others the faces of jackals or falcons. But not all of these creatures were evil. Many were guardians, servants of the gods, testing whether the soul was worthy to continue. To an Egyptian, the underworld was not hell. It was order and chaos intertwined. A cosmic landscape where the forces of light and darkness were locked in eternal struggle. Just as Ra fought the serpent Apophis every night to ensure the sun would rise again, every soul had to battle ignorance, fear, and impurity to reach the light of eternity. In this realm, the deceased might encounter familiar gods. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, recorded each event of the journey. He stood as both witness and guide, his calm intelligence cutting through the chaos. Then came Horus, the falcon-headed protector of kings, who offered strength and courage to those who proved loyal in life. Hathor, the gentle cow-headed goddess of love and motherhood, offered comfort to weary souls, welcoming them with a promise of peace. But none inspired more awe or fear than Osiris, Lord of the afterlife, ruler of the dead. He was not a god of decay, but of rebirth. His story lay at the heart of every Egyptian's hope for immortality. Long ago, Osiris had been slain by his jealous brother Set, his body scattered across Egypt. Yet through the devotion of his wife Isis, he was restored to life, becoming the eternal judge of souls. His resurrection was the model for every human death, the promise that through faith and righteousness, life could triumph over destruction. As the soul approached the great hall of judgment, the scene became solemn and grand. Pillars carved with divine symbols stretched into the shadows, and the air shimmered with divine energy. At the far end of the hall sat Osiris, cloaked in white and green, wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Around him stood 42 minor gods, each representing a different moral law. Before them, the heart of the deceased was placed upon the golden scale. The weighing of the heart was not just a test of truth, it was the culmination of a lifetime. Anubis, sleek and silent, adjusted the scale, while Thoth stood ready to record the outcome. On one side rested the heart, believed to contain all thoughts, deeds, and emotions. On the other side lay the feather of Maat, Maat was not a goddess in the distant sense. She was the living principle of balance and justice, the force that kept the stars in the sky, the Nile flowing, and society in harmony. Every Egyptian sought to live by her ideals, to speak truth, act fairly, and maintain order. To fail, Ma'at was to invite chaos, both in life and in death. The silence in the hall was absolute as the scale balanced. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul was declared pure. Osiris would rise and welcome the deceased into the field of reeds, the paradise of eternal peace. But if the heart was heavy, burdened by lies, cruelty, or greed, the outcome was final. Amit, the devourer, waited just beyond the scale. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, she symbolized the destruction of the unworthy. For those she devoured, there was no second chance, no rebirth. The soul simply ceased to exist, but imagine for a moment the triumph of a heart found pure. The gods smile. Thoth records the verdict in the Book of Life. The soul is given the Ankh, the key of eternal life, and led to the paradise it had dreamed of since birth, the Aru, or the field of reeds. To the Egyptians, this afterlife was not a realm of endless rest, but a perfected mirror of earthly existence. The soul would plough fertile fields, harvest crops without toil, sail across calm waters, and feast with family and ancestors. There was no hunger, no sickness, no sorrow, only eternal harmony. Time lost its meaning here. The seasons were gentle and unchanging, yet even in paradise the bond between the living and the dead continued. The Egyptians believed that the living could still nourish the ka through offerings of food, drink, and prayers. Family members would visit tombs during festivals, leaving bread, speaking the name of the departed aloud, so that their wren would never fade. In this way, love transcended death, and memory became sacred. Every part of Egyptian burial practice, the tomb design, the funerary texts, the small figurines called shabti buried beside the dead, existed to ensure a smooth transition into this perfect afterlife. The shabti were especially meaningful. Tiny servants made of clay or stone, each inscribed with a spell. Their purpose was to perform labor on behalf of the deceased in the field of reeds, allowing the soul to enjoy its eternal life without work or hardship. Even in the grandest tombs, these details carried intimate meaning. On the walls, scenes of banquets, farming, and music were painted not as decoration, but as acts of magic. By depicting them, the Egyptians believed they could make those joys real again in the afterlife. But as time passed, the rituals of death evolved. In the Old Kingdom, only pharaohs were promised eternal life, seen as divine intermediaries with the gods. Commoners hoped merely to share in their king's resurrection. Yet by the Middle Kingdom, this privilege expanded. The concept of the afterlife became democratic. Ordinary people began to believe that their own righteousness could earn them a place beside Osiris. The tombs of artisans, priests, and farmers began to reflect this growing faith, filled with inscriptions declaring moral purity and hope. This shift transformed Egyptian society. Mortality became a shared journey rather than a privilege of power. The Great Pyramids gave way to rock-cut tombs adorned with personal stories. The rich still commissioned elaborate funerary texts, but even the humble sought a good burial, one that honored their name and connected them with the gods. For the Egyptians, this devotion to eternity shaped every aspect of their daily life. To live was to prepare for death, not in fear, but in reverence. The same hands that sowed wheat for bread also kneaded clay for the shabti figurines. The same artisans who carved the pharaoh's tomb also crafted amulets for children. Death was never far from the Egyptian imagination, but neither was hope. In their eyes, the setting sun was not an ending but a promise that tomorrow it would rise again, reborn, just as the soul would rise in the field of reeds. In that cyclical faith, life and death became one. The living world mirrored the divine, and to honor Maat was to ensure balance in both realms. Every prayer, every offering, every carefully wrapped bandage of linen was a thread in the tapestry of eternity. And so, as the priests seal the tomb and the family departs, the desert wind whispers softly over the stones. The stars emerge, eternal witnesses to an ancient truth, that for the Egyptians, the end of life was only the beginning of forever. The golden sands of Egypt stretch endlessly beneath the blazing sun, and in that shimmering landscape, every stone whispers a story of eternity. The tombs, the temples, the hieroglyphs, all were built not merely to honor the living, but to preserve the souls of the dead. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not an event, but a continuation, a transformation as natural as the sunrise after night. When a person died, the journey toward immortality began almost immediately. The body was sacred, not because of vanity, but because it was the vessel of the Ka and the Ba, the twin elements of the soul. The Ka was the life force, the energy that made a person who they were. The Ba was the personality, capable of movement, able to leave the tomb and return. For both to survive, the body had to be preserved in perfect form. This belief gave birth to one of the most intricate funerary arts in human history: mummification. It wasn't simply about wrapping a corpse. It was about engineering immortality through devotion, precision, and ritual. The embalmers who performed this sacred duty were not ordinary laborers. They were priests, initiates of the goddess Anubis, and their work was a blend of science, prayer, and divine ceremony. The process began with purification. The body was washed in the waters of the Nile, symbolizing renewal. Then came the removal of the internal organs, the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, which were carefully cleaned, dried, and placed in canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus, divine guardians who ensured the organs would serve the deceased again in the afterlife. The heart, however, was left inside. The Egyptians believed it to be the seat of the soul, the record of a person's life. The brain, on the other hand, was considered useless. It was removed through the nostrils using hooked instruments, discarded without ceremony. A decision that still fascinates modern scholars. Once the organs were removed, the body was covered with natron, a natural salt found in the desert. For 40 days, it absorbed moisture, preventing decay and ensuring the skin would remain intact for eternity. The desiccated body was then anointed with oils, resins, and perfumes, each substance chosen for its symbolic meaning. Myrrh for purification, cedar oil for preservation, frankincense for divinity. Then came the wrappings, the most iconic step. Strips of fine linen, sometimes miles long, were wrapped around every limb, finger, and toe. Amulets were placed between layers: the scarab for rebirth, the eye of Horus for protection, the ankh for eternal life. Each bandage was sealed with prayers, every knot tied with a spell. The priests would chant over the body, invoking Anubis to recognize his beloved, ensuring the deceased's spirit could find and re-inhabit their form when the time came. Finally, the mummy was dressed and adorned. A painted mask, often made of cartonnage or gold, was placed over the face. This was not a portrait, but an idealized image, the perfected form the spirit would assume in the next life. The body was then laid within a series of nested coffins, each inscribed with protective texts and symbols. The outermost sarcophagus, often carved from stone, bore the name and titles of the deceased, their identity etched into eternity. But the preparation of the body was only one part of the great transition. Equally important was the preparation of the tomb, the eternal home of the soul. In ancient Egypt, tombs were built as bridges between the two worlds, the visible realm of the living and the invisible realm of the divine. The architecture reflected this belief. The earliest tombs, known as mastabas, were rectangular stone structures built above underground burial chambers. Their flat roofs and sloping sides mimicked the primeval mound from which the Egyptians believed creation first emerged. Over time, these mastabas evolved into the majestic pyramids of the Old Kingdom, colossal stairways to the heavens where pharaohs sought to join the gods. Every inch of these tombs served a purpose. On the walls, scenes of daily life were carved or painted in vivid colors. Farming, fishing, banquets, musicians playing harps and flutes. These weren't nostalgic memories, but magical depictions. The Egyptians believed that to represent something was to give it existence. If a loaf of bread or a jar of wine was painted on the wall, it would manifest for the soul in the afterlife. Tombs were stocked with everything the deceased might need for eternity. Furniture, weapons, tools, jewelry, cosmetics, even board games like Senet. Servants carved in wood or stone, known as ushabti, stood ready to labor on behalf of their master in the next world. In royal tombs, entire rooms were dedicated to boats, symbolic vessels that would carry the soul across the celestial river toward the afterlife. And then there was the final ceremony, the opening of the mouth. This ritual, performed at the tomb's entrance, was one of the most important in all Egyptian religion. The eldest son, or a priest dressed as Horus, would touch the mummy's mouth and eyes with a sacred tool shaped like an adze, reciting words of power. The purpose was to restore the senses, to allow the deceased to see, speak, and breathe again in the afterlife. With that gesture, the transformation was complete. The dead became eternal. But beneath the beauty of these rituals lay something deeper. A quiet anxiety shared by every Egyptian. The fear of being forgotten. To lose one's name was to die a second death. That's why names were carved on stone, repeated in prayers, and written in sacred texts. A person's immortality depended not just on the preservation of their body, but on remembrance. This belief shaped Egyptian culture profoundly. The living maintained the dead through offerings, festivals, and the recitation of names. Every year during the Feast of the Valley, families would cross the Nile to visit the necropolis, bringing food and flowers to their ancestors' tombs. The line between the living and the dead blurred. Both worlds sustained each other. Even the pharaoh, believed to be divine, relied on this system of memory and faith. The grandeur of the pyramids was not mere vanity, but an act of survival. Each monument was a physical invocation, an unending prayer in stone. The pharaoh's power extended beyond life, ensuring that the balance of Ma'at, truth, order, and justice, would continue forever. But not all tombs were built for kings. The middle and lower classes had their own versions of eternity. Simple graves lined with bricks or reeds contained miniature offerings and rough carvings of gods. Over time, these modest burials became increasingly elaborate as the concept of the afterlife democratized. What began as royal privilege became a universal right. By the New Kingdom, even artisans and scribes in places like Deir el-Medina constructed small, beautifully decorated tombs. Their walls told personal stories, scenes of family gatherings, prayers to Osiris, and visions of the afterlife. These weren't displays of wealth, but of devotion. In their artistry, we glimpse a society obsessed not with death, but with continuity, with the idea that love, duty, and spirit endured beyond the grave. At night, as the desert cooled and the stars emerged over the Nile, the tombs of Thebes, Saqqara, and Giza seemed to hum with unseen energy. The Egyptians believed the souls of the blessed rose to join the constellations, that the twinkling lights in the sky were not distant suns, but ancestors watching over the living. The cycle was complete, the dead became divine, and the divine returned to watch over life. And so, the culture of Egypt endured for millennia, built upon this sacred dialogue between life and death. Every pyramid, every sarcophagus, every prayer whispered in the flickering light of a tomb was a reaffirmation of the same belief, that nothing truly ends. To the ancient Egyptians, time itself was not linear but circular. The sun set each night only to rise again. The Nile flooded each year, bringing death to crops before nourishing them anew. Life and death mirrored that rhythm. One eternal breath, exhaled and inhaled across eternity. Theirs was not a morbid fascination with mortality, but a celebration of transformation. In every death they saw the seed of rebirth. In every tomb they built a promise. And as their civilization flourished along the Nile, generation after generation, that promise was fulfilled again and again, like the sunrise breaking over the desert horizon. Deep within the quiet of the tomb, past the sealed corridors and painted walls, the air is still, yet somehow alive. Every line of hieroglyphic text, every symbol of Anubis and Osiris, every painted eye seems to watch. The ancient Egyptians didn't merely decorate their tombs, they filled them with power. For them, words and images were living magic. To write something was to make it exist. That belief gave rise to one of the most fascinating and misunderstood aspects of Egyptian culture, the so-called curses of the pharaohs. To modern ears, these sound like superstitious warnings invented to frighten tomb robbers or entertain journalists centuries later. But to the Egyptians, they were something far more serious. They were acts of protection, spiritual seals guarding the fragile balance between life and death. When an Egyptian scribe carved a curse on a tomb wall, he wasn't threatening intruders with mere poetic justice. He was invoking the very laws of the cosmos. The texts appealed to the gods of vengeance and order, asking them to punish anyone who disturbed the sacred resting place. The desecration of a tomb wasn't only theft, it was an attack on Ma'at, the divine principle of harmony that held the universe together. A typical curse might read, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the dead." Another would warn, "May the crocodile be against him in the water, the snake against him on land, and the hippopotamus against him in the river." These weren't idle words. The Egyptians believed that every utterance, when carved or spoken with intention, became part of the spiritual architecture of the world. The tomb was a machine designed to preserve the soul, and every symbol, spell, and curse was a working piece of that machine. Yet not all protections were written as threats. Many were prayers, charms, and hymns to the gods, intended to guide and guard the deceased. In the Book of the Dead, known to the Egyptians as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the soul was equipped with the knowledge needed to navigate the perils of the afterlife. The book was not a single scripture, but a collection of spells tailored to each person, inscribed on papyrus scrolls and placed within the tomb. These texts describe the soul's perilous journey through the Duat, the underworld. It was a landscape of gates, guardians, and monsters, a reflection of the cosmic struggle between chaos and order. The dead would face tests at each stage, answering questions and reciting passwords to prove their purity. One of the most dramatic moments came at the Hall of Two Truths, where the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, unburdened by wrongdoing, the soul would pass into the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal peace. But if it was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Amit, a terrifying creature part lion, hippopotamus, and crocodile. To the Egyptians, this wasn't punishment, it was the natural order at work. The balance of Ma'at could not be disturbed. To prepare for that moment, Egyptians carried amulets, small, sacred objects that held divine power. These amulets weren't mere decorations. They were spiritual tools, each with a specific purpose. The scarab beetle, symbolizing transformation and rebirth, was placed over the heart. The Eye of Horus protected against evil spirits. The Jed pillar, representing the backbone of Osiris, granted stability and strength in the afterlife. The craftsmanship behind these amulets was extraordinary. Gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise. Each material held symbolic meaning. Gold was the flesh of the gods, imperishable and radiant. Lapis represented the night sky, the realm of the divine. Even the shapes were precise. The ankh, for example, combined a cross-like form with a loop, symbolizing the union of male and female, life and eternity. These charms were often wrapped within the mummy's layers, each positioned carefully with corresponding incantations. The Book of the Dead would specify where to place them and what to say as they were applied. A single misplaced amulet or mispronounced spell could, in their view, jeopardize the soul's safe passage, and yet, even as these preparations grew increasingly elaborate, they reflected something profoundly human: the longing to be remembered, to be safe, to endure. The Egyptians were not obsessed with death, as so many imagine. They were obsessed with living forever. Their vision of paradise was not an abstract heaven, but a continuation of the best parts of earthly life. In the field of reeds, one could plow fertile land, harvest abundant crops, and live with one's family in peace. The ideal life was simple, balanced, and eternal. A mirror of the world they knew, perfected. But paradise was not easily earned. The dead had to speak a series of negative confessions before the gods, declaring their innocence of various sins. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. I have not polluted the water. Each statement reaffirmed their alignment with Ma'at. The gods, led by Osiris, listened carefully. The fate of the soul depended on truth. The ritual of weighing the heart was not just judgment, it was purification. If the soul passed, it joined the stars. If not, it dissolved back into chaos. The Egyptians found comfort in that balance. It meant that the universe was just. That order always triumphed. Even the night sky held reminders of this belief. The Milky Way was seen as a celestial river, the reflection of the Nile along which souls journeyed to eternity. The constellation of Orion represented Osiris, the god of the afterlife, eternally reborn with the rising of the stars. The sun's daily voyage across the heavens mirrored the soul's path, descending into darkness each evening, only to rise again in radiant rebirth. This cosmic rhythm shaped every aspect of Egyptian religion. Life, death, and resurrection were not separate stages, but cycles within one eternal flow. That's why the imagery of rebirth, the lotus flower, the rising sun, the scarab, appeared everywhere in tombs and temples. Each reminded the living that nothing truly ended, only transformed. Even the act of burial itself reflected this faith. The mummy was positioned facing east, toward the sunrise. When the first light of dawn touched the tomb, it symbolically awakened the soul. The architecture of many tombs aligned perfectly with solar or stellar events, a harmony between heaven and earth that reaffirmed divine order. Among the most awe-inspiring examples is the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its narrow shafts oriented toward specific stars associated with the afterlife. Scholars still debate the precision of these alignments, but to the Egyptians, it was simple. The pharaoh's soul would ascend through those passages to join the gods. For ordinary Egyptians, that same promise existed on a smaller scale. Even the humblest graves featured symbolic offerings and prayers. The afterlife was not a privilege of kings, but the destiny of all who lived in accordance with Ma'at. Over centuries, this idea transformed Egyptian spirituality into something deeply egalitarian, a belief system that gave every person, rich or poor, the hope of eternal peace. It's easy, from a modern perspective, to see these beliefs as myth, poetic attempts to explain the unknown. But to the Egyptians it was reality. Death was simply the next chapter of life, and their preparations were as practical as any plan for the future. Their tombs, their scrolls, their amulets, all were insurance for eternity. Yet beneath the ritual lay something timeless: love. Love for family, for tradition, for the natural world that sustained them. The prayers carved into stone often mention not only gods, but children, parents, and friends. The dead asked not just for glory, but for remembrance, kindness, and reunion. And perhaps that's why, thousands of years later, their voices still reach us. In their careful preservation of the body, they preserved something else: their story. Every tomb opened by archaeologists, every papyrus unrolled, every amulet uncovered is a whisper from that ancient civilization, still alive in the desert air. The hidden rule of Egyptian death was simple and profound. To remember is to live. As long as one's name is spoken, one's spirit endures. So when modern visitors stand before the golden mask of Tutankhamun or read the faded inscriptions in a forgotten tomb, they are, in a sense, fulfilling that ancient promise. They are keeping the dead alive, granting them the immortality they sought. And if you listen closely, you can almost imagine their gratitude in the silence of the stone chambers. The hum of eternity that echoes through the corridors of the past is not one of fear, but of peace. Because to the ancient Egyptians, death was never an ending. It was the beginning of forever, a journey guided by the stars, protected by gods, and illuminated by the undying light of memory. When the ancient Egyptians imagined death, they did not see it as a simple transition from life to nothingness. To them, it was the start of an epic journey, a voyage through an unseen world, mysterious and treacherous, known as the Duat. This underworld was not a place of eternal punishment or suffering, as in later religious traditions. It was a landscape of trials, mirrors, and truths, a divine reflection of the living world, where the soul's strength, wisdom, and purity were tested before it could enter paradise. The moment a person took their final breath, their spirit, called the Ka, was believed to rise gently from the body. The Ka was the essence of life itself, a twin spirit that stayed with a person from birth. When death came, the Ka remained close to the body, reluctant to leave. That is why preserving the corpse was so vital. It provided the Ka a home, a familiar vessel it could return to even after death. The Ka was not alone. It was joined by the Ba, the aspect of the soul that carried one's personality. The voice, the laughter, the memory, the individuality. The Ba was often depicted as a human-headed bird, free to travel between the worlds of the living and the dead. Together, the Ka and Ba would later unite to form the Ak, the radiant transfigured spirit, but a being of pure light that could dwell among the gods. However, before the soul could reach that blessed state, it had to pass through the Duat. This was not a physical realm that could be mapped on Earth, but a spiritual dimension filled with rivers of fire, lakes of darkness, mountains of iron, and caverns inhabited by strange hybrid creatures. The geography of the Duat was described in sacred texts such as the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns, and the Amduat, all of which offered glimpses of what awaited beyond death. These texts were more than theological writings. They were survival manuals. They told the soul what to say, where to go, whom to greet, and how to overcome the dangers of the night. Each passage of the Duat represented a challenge of truth, a way to test whether the deceased truly lived in harmony with Ma'at, the universal order of justice, truth, and balance. The journey began at sunset, when the god Ra, the sun itself, descended into the western horizon. Just as the sun disappeared below the earth, so too did the souls of the dead begin their descent. The west, the direction of dusk, symbolized the entry to the underworld. Egyptian tombs were often built on the western side of the Nile for this reason. They were gates to the world beyond. In the Duat, Ra sailed his golden boat through 12 regions, each corresponding to 1 hour of the night. With him traveled a retinue of gods, including Thoth, the divine scribe, and Ma'at herself, who ensured that cosmic order was maintained. The deceased, if righteous and properly prepared, was believed to join Ra on this journey, sharing in his trials and triumphs. Each hour brought new challenges. In the first, the soul had to face the guardians of the western gates, fearsome deities who demanded passwords and secret names. Without these, the gates would not open, and the unprepared soul would be left to wander eternally in darkness. These passwords were provided in the funerary texts, meticulously written on tomb walls and sarcophagi, to ensure the deceased had access to them. As the solar boat continued, it passed through realms of burning waters and shadowy fields. There were gods with the heads of serpents, demons with blades for arms, and lakes where the unworthy were dissolved into oblivion. But to those who carried Ma'at in their hearts, these horrors were powerless. The righteous soul moved forward, guided by light and divine favor. In the middle of the night, the most dangerous phase began. The confrontation with Apophis, the great serpent of chaos. Apophis was the eternal enemy of Ra, a being born from darkness itself. Each night, he tried to devour the sun and plunge the universe into eternal night. In this cosmic battle, the soul joined the gods in defending the light. Priests in the living world even performed rituals to help Ra in this struggle, reciting spells to weaken Apophis and burn his body with sacred fire. The belief was that the balance of the cosmos depended on this victory. If Ra's journey failed, dawn would never come, and creation itself would unravel. When Ra triumphed, as he always did, the world was renewed. The eastern horizon glowed with the promise of sunrise. For the soul, this meant rebirth. Having survived the night and proven its purity, it could now stand before the divine court for judgment. This was the moment of truth, the weighing of the heart. In the grand hall of two truths, Osiris sat upon his throne, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and holding the crook and flail, symbols of kingship and justice. Before him stood the soul, trembling but resolute. To one side stood Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, who carefully placed the heart of the deceased on a golden scale. On the other side, the feather of Ma'at shimmered, the measure of absolute truth. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, recorded the outcome on his scroll. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul was declared true of voice, Ma Keru. It was free to enter the eternal paradise, but if it was heavier, burdened by lies, cruelty, or greed, it was cast to the ground, where Amit awaited. This monstrous creature devoured the heart, condemning the soul to the second death, annihilation. This concept of judgment was not one of vengeance, but of balance. The Egyptians believed the heart revealed one's true nature. It could not lie. In fact, they refused to remove the heart during mummification because it was essential for this final test. They placed the scarab amulet over it instead, inscribed with spell 30b from the Book of the Dead, which pleaded, "O my heart, do not stand up as a witness against me. Do not speak lies in the presence of the great God. If the soul passed this trial, a radiant transformation followed. It was no longer bound by the frailties of the human body. The Akh, the transfigured spirit, emerged, shining like the stars. This was the moment of divine rebirth, the fulfillment of every hope written in the tombs. The soul then entered the field of reeds, the eternal paradise. Imagine a land that looked like Egypt at its most perfect. Golden fields swaying in the sunlight, clear canals brimming with fish, gentle breezes carrying the scent of lotus flowers. Families reunited there, free from hunger, toil, or sorrow. The righteous plowed their fields, sang songs, and offered prayers to the gods, living forever in peace and abundance. Yet even in paradise, the Egyptians believed the dead could visit the living. On special days, the BA could travel back to the mortal world, drawn by offerings left by descendants. That's why families visited tombs, bringing bread, flowers, and incense. The offering wasn't symbolic, it was real nourishment for the car. Without it, the soul could weaken. This mutual relationship between the living and the dead kept the spiritual order alive. This belief system created an unbroken chain between generations. The living sustained the dead with remembrance, and the dead, in turn, protected the living with blessings. Every prayer whispered in a temple, every libation poured on the tomb floor, strengthened that bond. Over time, this vision of the afterlife evolved. In the Old Kingdom, only pharaohs could join the gods, while commoners hoped merely for peace. But by the Middle and New Kingdoms, that privilege had expanded to all, a reflection of Egypt's growing belief in moral equality under Maat. The afterlife became not just the reward of kings, but of anyone who lived with truth, kindness, and balance. It's a vision both ancient and startlingly modern. Beneath the layers of ritual and myth lies a philosophy that speaks to the deepest human instinct, the need for meaning, justice, and hope beyond the grave. The Egyptians found comfort not in escaping death, but in understanding it as part of a greater order. To them, every sunrise was proof that death could be conquered, that light would always return. The same sun that disappeared each evening was reborn each dawn. In their eyes, so too could every human soul rise again, renewed, purified, eternal. The modern world, with all its skepticism and science, may have moved away from these beliefs, but the essence of what the Egyptians taught still lingers. We still visit graves, still speak the names of our ancestors, still light candles to remember those we've lost. In doing so, we unknowingly echo the same faith that built the pyramids, the faith that memory is immortality. When you stand in front of an ancient tomb, you're not just looking at stone and paint. You're looking at a promise, one made thousands of years ago by a people who refused to believe that death was the end. A promise that even after the body turns to dust, the spirit endures, carried by light, by love, and by the whisper of its name across eternity. Before the journey through the underworld could even begin, the Egyptians believed that the body had to be perfectly preserved, for it was not just a vessel, but a sacred anchor for the soul. The process of mummification was their answer to the great mystery of decay, a way to conquer time and cheat oblivion. To the Egyptians, this wasn't merely an act of preservation, it was an act of resurrection. It began soon after death. Once the final breath escaped the body, professional embalmers took charge, often priests themselves, specially trained in the sacred art. Their workshop was a place of solemn reverence, half laboratory, half temple. Incense filled the air to purify the space, and the tools used were considered holy instruments, capable of bridging the mortal and divine. The embalmers first washed the body with water from the Nile, the river that had sustained Egyptian life for millennia. It was both a physical and spiritual cleansing, symbolizing renewal. Then came the most delicate task, the removal of the internal organs. Decay began from within, and the Egyptians knew this well. Using a hooked instrument inserted through the nostrils, the brain was carefully extracted in pieces, a process both ingenious and horrifying to modern eyes. They believed the brain had little significance compared to the heart, which was the seat of thought, emotion, and morality. Next, a small incision was made on the left side of the abdomen, through which the lungs, stomach, intestines, and liver were removed. Each organ was then dried, wrapped, and stored in its own canopic jar. Each jar guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imseti, with a human head, protected the liver. Hapi, the baboon-headed god, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, with a jackal head, watched over the stomach, and Kebesenuef, the falcon-headed guardian, kept the intestines safe. The heart, however, was left in place, never to be disturbed. It would be needed in the afterlife to be weighed against the feather of Maat. To remove it would be to strip away the essence of the soul. Once the internal organs were removed, the body was stuffed with linen, resin, and sometimes aromatic herbs to keep its shape. It was then buried in a substance called natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture found in the desert. Natron was the key to Egypt's mastery of preservation. It drew moisture from the flesh, desiccating the body while preventing decay. For 40 days, the body lay in natron, transforming silently. Slowly, the skin tightened, the body dried, and the earthly form began to resemble something timeless, a figure suspended between life and death. When the embalmers returned, what they uncovered was not a corpse, but a vessel waiting for eternity. After the body was washed again and anointed with sacred oils, the real ritual began: the wrapping. This stage was not merely practical, it was deeply spiritual. Each strip of linen represented protection, each knot a spell of power. The priests recited verses from the Book of the Dead as they wrapped the limbs, torso, and head, invoking the names of gods to guard every part. Amulets were placed between the layers of linen, tiny tokens of divine magic. A scarab amulet over the heart to silence judgment. A jed pillar along the spine to grant stability. An eye of Horus over the chest for healing. Each amulet carried an ancient prayer, a whisper of immortality. As the priests worked, they did not speak idly. Every gesture had meaning. The right hand crossed over the chest symbolized Osiris, the god of resurrection. The placement of the wrappings followed strict order: fingers, toes, limbs, torso, face, until the body was entirely cocooned in linen. When finished, the mummy was covered in a shroud and placed inside a wooden coffin painted with vibrant symbols, protective deities, hieroglyphic prayers, and scenes from the afterlife. Wealthier Egyptians had multiple nested coffins, each more ornate than the last, all enclosed within a stone sarcophagus. Finally came one of the most sacred moments in the ritual: the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was performed in front of the tomb before burial. A priest, often wearing the mask of Anubis, touched a ceremonial tool, shaped like a small adze, to the mouth of the mummy. This symbolic gesture reopened the senses of the deceased, restoring the ability to breathe, speak, see, and eat in the afterlife. Chants filled the air, and incense rose like prayers turned to smoke. The priest would say, "May your mouth be opened by Ptah, your speech restored by Thoth. May you breathe the air of the living and eat the bread of eternity." With that, the transformation was complete. The dead was no longer a body, but a being reborn. The funeral procession that followed was both a display of devotion and a bridge between worlds. Family members, mourners, and priests escorted the mummy to its tomb. Women wailed, tearing their garments and covering their hair with dust, echoing the ancient cries of Isis and Nephthys, mourning Osiris. Musicians played sistrums and drums, their rhythms both mournful and sacred. The tomb itself was a masterpiece of faith. The walls were adorned with scenes from the deceased's life, farming, fishing, banquets, offerings, as if the soul would continue these joys in the field of reeds. Hieroglyphic spells from the Book of the Dead covered the walls like invisible guardians, ensuring safe passage through the Duat. Inside the burial chamber, treasures were placed with care. Everyday objects, sandals, combs, jewelry, amulets, food, wine, and tools were arranged as if the deceased might rise at any moment and need them again. Miniature servants, called shabtis, were tucked into boxes. These small figurines bore inscriptions promising they would work for the deceased in the afterlife, performing any labor that might be demanded by the gods. Once everything was in place, the coffin was lowered into the sarcophagus, and the priests sealed the tomb. They poured libations of milk and wine, burned incense, and recited final prayers. Then the stone door was rolled shut, locking the world of the living away from the realm of the dead. But for the Egyptians, that closing was not the end. It was a beginning, the opening of eternity. To them, the afterlife was not a vague or abstract notion. It was as tangible as the rising sun, as real as the flood of the Nile. The rituals of death reflected their reverence for life itself. Every act of preservation, every chant, every offering was an expression of gratitude, a belief that existence in all its forms was sacred and cyclical. The rich could afford lavish tombs, golden sarcophagi, and entire books of spells. The poor might only have a few amulets and a simple burial, but all were equal in the eyes of the gods when their hearts were weighed. It was not wealth that determined salvation, but the purity of one's soul, the truth of one's deeds. This deep moral symmetry defined Egyptian spirituality. The universe itself, they believed, was built on Ma'at, the divine order of truth, harmony, and justice. To live in alignment with Ma'at meant to act with honesty, kindness, and balance. To stray from it was to invite chaos. Even pharaohs were bound by this cosmic law. Their role was not only to rule, but to maintain Ma'at on earth, to ensure the floods came, the temples thrived, and the people prospered. A corrupt ruler could throw the entire cosmos into disorder. Thus, morality was not only personal, it was universal. As centuries passed, the rituals of mummification evolved, yet the essence remained the same. In the Old Kingdom, only kings were mummified and granted divine afterlives. But by the New Kingdom, even farmers, artisans, and soldiers could hope for immortality. This democratization of eternity was one of Egypt's most profound transformations. A shift from divine privilege to spiritual equality. Archaeologists today, uncovering tombs lost for millennia, find traces of this longing for eternal life. In every artifact, in a carved scarab, a painted eye, a line of hieroglyphs reading, "May you live forever." Behind the golden grandeur was something deeply human, the refusal to accept that love, memory, and soul could vanish with death. The act of mummification, then, was not about death at all. It was about continuity, about preserving the human story against the tides of time. It was an act of hope written in linen and salt, a declaration that even after the body fades, the spirit endures. To the Egyptians, the world was a great rhythm. The sun rising and setting, the Nile flooding and receding, life beginning and ending, only to begin again. Their afterlife was not some faraway paradise, but a continuation of this natural order. A more perfect reflection of life's beauty and balance, even today. Standing before a mummy sealed over 3,000 years ago, one feels that quiet defiance, that ancient conviction that death is not an end but a doorway. And behind that still face of linen and resin beneath those golden masks, there remains a whisper that time cannot silence. I was, I am, I will be. Deep within the heart of ancient Egyptian belief lay one great trial that awaited every soul. A test so sacred, so absolute, that even kings trembled at its prospect. The moment of judgment was the culmination of all things. It was where every life, no matter how humble or grand, would be weighed and measured before the gods. The Egyptians called it the weighing of the heart. It was not just a symbolic tale or a religious parable, but it was the ultimate truth that guided their entire civilization. Every prayer, every offering, every act of kindness or cruelty was carried into this moment. The heart, they believed, recorded everything. In the afterlife, the soul's journey would lead it through a series of trials within the Duat, the mysterious underworld. It was a place of shifting darkness, filled with gates guarded by fierce spirits, lakes of fire, and serpents coiled with divine vengeance. Each region of the Duat was ruled by a different guardian, and to pass, the deceased needed to know the correct spells, names, and passwords. Without them, the soul could be trapped forever, lost in eternal shadow. This is why the Book of the Dead, known to the Egyptians as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, was so vital. It was not one book, but a collection of spells, prayers, and illustrations inscribed on papyrus and placed in the tomb. Each page was a map of salvation, a divine guide to help the soul navigate the perils ahead. By torchlight, guided by the god Anubis, the soul would approach the Hall of Two Truths. There, Osiris, lord of the underworld, sat enthroned, his skin green as renewal, his crown tall and white, the crook and flail crossed upon his chest. Around him gathered 42 divine judges, each representing a principle of Ma'at, the cosmic order. The air shimmered with sacred silence as the soul was brought forth. Anubis would then lead the deceased to the great golden scales. On one side rested the heart placed carefully upon the pan. On the other side, a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth and justice. The ritual was terrifying in its simplicity. If the heart was pure and balanced with the feather, the soul was declared Maya Keru, true of voice. The deceased would be welcomed into the eternal paradise of the Field of Reeds, where the sun shone forever and the Nile never failed to flood. But if the heart was heavy with sin, weighed down by lies, greed, or cruelty, then the outcome was far darker. Waiting nearby was Amit, the devourer, a monstrous creature part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. With one snap of her jaws, the impure heart would be consumed and the soul annihilated. To the Egyptians, this was the true death, the second death, and the complete erasure of being. It was this belief that made morality not just a social value, but a cosmic duty. Egyptians didn't simply obey laws for fear of punishment. They lived righteously to keep the balance of Ma'at intact. In their homes, their work, their prayers, and their treatment of others. The Declaration of Innocence, often recited before the divine judges, was both confession and defense. The deceased would stand and say, "I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not slain men and women, I have not spoken falsely, I have not caused pain, I have not polluted the waters of the Nile, I have not withheld bread from the hungry, nor denied milk to the children." 42 declarations in all, one for each judge. Each statement reaffirmed the individual's harmony with Maat. To live well in Egypt was to ensure that your heart would one day balance the feather. The beauty of this belief was its equality. Pharaohs might have pyramids and treasures, but even they faced the scales with the same vulnerability as a farmer or craftsman. Death stripped away rank, leaving only truth. If the soul passed the weighing, the gods would embrace it, and Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of wisdom, would record the verdict in his scrolls. The path to eternity would open, and the soul would follow Horus, the falcon-headed god, to the gates of paradise. There awaited the field of reeds, a mirror of the Egypt they had known, but perfect and eternal. The same fertile land, the same glimmering river, the same gentle breezes that rippled through papyrus reeds. Here, the soul would reunite with family and friends, till fields that never failed to bear fruit, sailboats along endless waterways, and live in peace beneath the eternal sun. Even in paradise, order was maintained. The gods watched, the sun still rose and set, and Ma'at ruled supreme. Eternity for the Egyptians was not chaos or dreamlike fantasy. It was continuity, a perfect reflection of the world they had cherished, purified of all sorrow and decay. This vision gave their lives profound meaning. To plant a seed, to raise a child, to honor the gods, all were acts that resonated beyond the grave. The afterlife was not distant. It was an extension of the present built by one's deeds. Daily life itself was infused with these beliefs. Farmers would pray to Osiris before planting their crops, invoking his power over the earth and renewal. Mothers would whisper blessings of Maat over their children, hoping to fill their hearts with lightness. Even craftsmen carving stone or weaving linen would inscribe symbols of eternity, ankhs, scarabs, lotus flowers, into their work. Every gesture was sacred. Temples, too, served as bridges between the mortal and divine. Within their towering walls, priests performed rituals that mirrored the cosmic order. Each morning, they awakened the statues of gods with incense and hymns, offering food, wine, and flowers. The belief was that by sustaining the gods with devotion, the universe itself remained in balance. In private homes, small household shrines held clay figures of protective deities. Bes, the cheerful dwarf god who guarded families, or Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. People prayed for good health, safe journeys, and successful harvests, knowing that divine harmony began within the smallest corners of life. Even festivals reflected the same philosophy. The annual Feast of the Valley saw families sailing across the Nile to visit the tombs of ancestors, bringing food and flowers. They believed the dead could join them, if only for a night, to share in the joy of remembrance. Death was not separation, but a thin veil, one that love could pierce through ritual and memory. This closeness to death was not morbid, but comforting. Egyptians accepted mortality as part of the eternal rhythm. The same way the Nile withdrew and returned, life too retreated only to flow again. And yet, behind this serene belief lay an immense effort to maintain order. Every priest, scribe, and artisan contributed to a cosmic machinery designed to keep chaos, Isfet, at bay. To the Egyptian mind, chaos was the greatest threat, the unraveling of harmony, the undoing of creation. Pharaohs were seen as the living embodiment of Maat. Their role was not just political, but divine. They were intermediaries between gods and men, charged with maintaining balance through rituals, justice, and the construction of temples. When a pharaoh ruled well, the Nile flooded on time, crops flourished, and the people prospered. When disorder crept into the realm, famine, invasion, rebellion, it was seen as a sign that Maat had been disturbed. The grand architecture of Egypt reflected this cosmic order. The alignment of temples with the stars, the symmetry of pylons, the precision of hieroglyphs, all were expressions of harmony. Nothing was random. Everything was part of a larger pattern that connected heaven and earth. Even their art served this purpose. Figures were drawn not for realism but for meaning. The body was shown in composite form, head and legs in profile, eyes and torso front-facing, to present the most complete and truthful version of a person. Truth in Egyptian thought was not what one saw, but what one understood to be eternal. Their language, too, carried divine resonance. Hieroglyphs were not mere letters, but living symbols. To carve a name was to give it life. To erase a name was to destroy its soul. This is why damnatio memoriae, the act of erasing a ruler's name, was considered a punishment worse than death. It condemned a person to spiritual extinction. As centuries passed, these beliefs endured with astonishing consistency. From the pyramids of Giza to the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, from the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemaic Age, the Egyptian obsession with eternity never wavered. The gods changed names, dynasties fell, empires rose and crumbled, but the promise of immortality remained the heartbeat of their civilization. For all their mysteries and magnificence, perhaps the most striking truth about ancient Egypt is how deeply human their spirituality was. Beneath the layers of gold and divine imagery lay simple hope. To see loved ones again, to be remembered, to live in peace. Their gods reflected these emotions too. Isis, the devoted mother; Osiris, the just ruler; Anubis, the careful guardian; Ra, the eternal light. In their stories, the universe was not ruled by indifferent forces, but by beings who mirrored the struggles of men and women. Loss, love, betrayal, and renewal. The myth of Osiris itself captured the essence of their faith. Osiris, once a living king, was betrayed and slain by his jealous brother Set. His body was cut into pieces and scattered across Egypt. But Isis, his devoted wife, searched tirelessly, gathering each fragment, binding him together with love and magic. Through her devotion, Osiris was reborn, not in the land of the living, but as ruler of the dead. His resurrection became the symbol of eternal life and the cycle of nature itself. Every seed that sprouted from the Nile's silt was a reminder of Osiris rising again. Every sunrise was Ra's victory over darkness. Every act of kindness restored May to the world. In the silent stillness of eternity, once the heart was found pure and the scales of Maat had tipped toward truth, the soul was free at last to cross into paradise, the realm known as the Field of Reeds. This was no distant heaven beyond imagination. It was a perfected version of Egypt itself, untouched by drought, famine, or decay. The Nile flowed forever beneath a golden sky, fields of wheat swayed endlessly in warm breezes, and lotus blossoms opened under the eternal light of Ra. The land was fertile, the air gentle, and the horizon glowed with unending dawn. Here, the souls of the righteous lived exactly as they had in life, farming, building, celebrating, and working in harmony, but without pain, hunger, or death. Every joy of the mortal world continued, purified and eternal. The Egyptian paradise was not about abandoning life, it was about living it perfectly, forever. Those who entered the Field of Reeds were reunited with their loved ones. Families who had been separated by time and mortality could once again walk side by side. Husbands saw their wives as they had been in youth. Children ran laughing through the tall grain, their laughter echoing under the sun that never set. It was a vision not of endless idleness, but of everlasting fulfillment. At the heart of this paradise flowed the river that connected all things, the same divine Nile that sustained the living world. It represented not just sustenance, but the cycle of rebirth, the eternal pulse that linked gods and mortals. The Egyptian belief in this afterlife was profound, not only for its beauty, but for its balance. They believed that the living and the dead existed in a shared continuum. The living maintained the memory of the dead through offerings and rituals, and in return, the dead blessed the living with health, fertility, and protection. Life and death were two halves of the same eternal cycle. Every offering made in the temples, the bread, fruits, incense, and prayers, was a way of sustaining this sacred balance. Priests acting as intermediaries ensured that the gods and the spirits of the departed continued to receive what they needed to maintain harmony in both worlds. The connection between the living and the dead was kept alive through the daily ritual that played out across the kingdom. Each morning, as the sun rose over the desert horizon, the priests would awaken the gods with hymns and music. They believed that Ra, the sun god, died every evening, traveling through the dark underworld, battling chaos and monsters, and was reborn each morning at dawn. This cycle of death and rebirth reflected the destiny of every soul. Just as Ra rose again after his nightly descent, so too would the soul rise from the tomb into eternal life. The tomb was not a place of sorrow. It was a doorway, a vessel for transformation. Inside these tombs, everything was arranged with meticulous care. The walls were covered in painted scenes, the deceased hunting, feasting, farming, or sitting with family, all depictions of how they wished to live forever. Hieroglyphic texts accompanied the images, invoking spells of protection and guidance. Every color, symbol, and shape carried meaning. Blue represented the divine and eternal sky. Green symbolized rebirth and vegetation. Gold embodied the flesh of the gods. The Egyptians believed that to speak or see these images was to keep them alive. Thus, painting a man harvesting wheat ensured he would harvest eternally. Showing a woman dancing guaranteed her joy in the next world. In this way, art itself became a bridge between life and eternity. And yet the path to paradise was not without peril. Between the tomb and the field of reeds lay the treacherous Duat, the underworld. It was a labyrinth of darkness, guarded by strange and terrifying beings. Serpents with flaming eyes, demons bearing knives, and lakes of boiling water. Only those who knew the sacred names of these creatures could pass unharmed. The Book of the Dead served as a guide through these trials, offering spells for every danger. "O serpent with burning eyes," one incantation would say, "depart from me. I know your name. I am protected by Ra." The knowledge of names was power. To name a thing was to control it, to bind it to order rather than chaos. This is why literacy and knowledge were held in such high esteem in ancient Egypt. Scribes who could write and recite the sacred texts were seen as the keepers of divine wisdom. Their work was not just administrative, it was spiritual. They ensured that words, the very essence of life, endured beyond death. The journey through the Duat mirrored the nightly voyage of Ra himself. Each night, Ra sailed through the underworld in his solar bark, facing 12 gates guarded by monstrous entities. In each hour, he battled the forces of Isfet, chaos and darkness, until he emerged victorious at dawn, reborn as the rising sun. In death, the soul joined Ra in this celestial journey, sailing across the underworld and emerging renewed. Thus, every Egyptian burial ritual echoed the rhythm of the cosmos: descent, struggle, and rebirth. Osiris, god of the afterlife, embodied this eternal cycle. Once a mortal king, Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set, who dismembered his body and scattered it across Egypt. But Isis, Osiris's devoted wife, searched tirelessly for his remains, reassembling him piece by piece, breathing life back into him through divine magic. From their union came Horus, the falcon-headed god, symbolizing continuity and renewal. Through Osiris, the Egyptians learned that death was not destruction, but transformation. Just as the seed must die to sprout, so too must the soul pass through darkness to reach the light. Every tomb, every ritual, every offering was a reflection of this belief. Even the architecture of their tombs followed the same philosophy. The descent into the burial chamber symbolized the journey into the underworld, while the decorations on the walls guided the soul upward again toward the sunlit afterlife. The very structure of the tomb was a metaphor for resurrection, and yet, for all its grandeur, Egyptian spirituality was deeply personal. A farmer working the fields, a potter shaping clay, a mother nursing her child, all lived with the quiet understanding that their actions mattered in the grand cosmic order. To live in accordance with Ma'at, with truth, balance, and justice, was to ensure eternal harmony. The Egyptians saw morality not as imposed law, but as a reflection of the universe itself. Every dishonest act, every broken oath, every cruel word disrupted Ma'at and allowed Isfet to creep in. But every act of kindness, every gesture of generosity restored balance. Thus their society was not merely governed by rulers or laws, but by a spiritual principle that bound everyone together. From pharaoh to peasant, all were accountable before the same scales of the afterlife. The pharaoh, however, carried the greatest responsibility. As the living embodiment of Ma'at, his duty was to uphold divine order on earth. His decrees, temples, and rituals were all designed to mirror the balance of the heavens. When the pharaoh ruled justly, the Nile flooded, crops grew, and peace reigned. When he faltered, famine and chaos followed, not merely as punishment, but as imbalance in the cosmic fabric. This is why so much of Egypt's art and architecture centered on symmetry and alignment. The temples faced the rising sun. Statues stood in perfect proportion. Pyramids pointed toward the stars. The harmony of the physical world reflected the harmony of the spiritual. Even time itself was seen as cyclical rather than linear. The Egyptians did not believe in a final end, but in perpetual renewal. The daily rebirth of Ra, the yearly flooding of the Nile, the endless rotation of life and death. Every cycle was a reaffirmation of existence, and through it all, death was never feared. It was anticipated, prepared for, even celebrated. A good death meant a well-lived life, a heart light as the feather of Ma'at, and a soul ready to sail the eternal river. For thousands of years, this belief endured, shaping every aspect of Egyptian culture. When later civilizations in Greek, Roman, even modern, tried to understand the secret of Egypt's longevity, they often looked to its monuments, its mathematics, or its military might. But the true secret lay in its faith. It was a civilization built not just on stone and river, but on meaning. A world where every sunrise was sacred, every act was part of eternity, and every human heart was a reflection of the divine. The ancient Egyptians believed they were not merely living their lives, they were rehearsing for eternity. Each day was a step in the journey that would continue after death. Each breath was a promise that the soul would one day rise again with the sun. And when the desert winds whisper across the sands of the Nile, when the stars still align with the ancient temples, one can almost feel their presence. The eternal echo of a people who refuse to see death as an ending, but as the beginning of something far greater. For them, immortality was not a dream, it was a duty. Deep within the heart of ancient Egypt's grand temples and dusty tombs lay more than just the pursuit of eternal life. It was a reflection of their entire worldview, their philosophy of existence. Life, death, and the afterlife were not separate things. They were chapters in one unending cycle. To an ancient Egyptian, the sun rising and setting each day was not just a natural phenomenon. It was a divine message. The journey of Ra, the sun god, across the sky symbolized life, and his nightly descent into the underworld mirrored death and rebirth. As Ra fought off the serpent Apophis in darkness and re-emerged victorious each morning, the Egyptians saw proof that life conquered death, again and again. This belief shaped how they lived. Every decision, from the layout of a house to the colors of a mural, was guided by spiritual purpose. Temples were aligned to the stars, tombs were filled with protective spells, and even the simplest household had small shrines where offerings were made to ancestors. To them, the world was alive with divine presence. The Nile itself was sacred, or was it the giver of life and sustainer of civilization? Its yearly flood was not just a natural event, but a divine blessing, a renewal that echoed their deepest hope, that death, too, would bring new life. When you imagine an ordinary Egyptian farmer working under the sun, you can see that faith woven into every motion. As he tilled the soil or offered a portion of his harvest to the temple, he wasn't just fulfilling duty, he was participating in a cosmic order. Ma'at, the divine balance of truth, justice, and harmony, was the moral compass that governed all life. Kings ruled by it, priests upheld it, and commoners sought to live within it. To die in accordance with Ma'at was to be guaranteed a place in the eternal afterlife. Inside the temples, priests performed daily rituals that mirrored the cycle of death and rebirth. At dawn, they opened the sanctuary to awaken the statue of the god, chanting hymns and presenting food and perfume. By night, they sealed it again, symbolizing the god's rest in the afterlife. These sacred routines reinforced the Egyptians' conviction that divine order must never cease, for even the smallest disruption could invite chaos. Isfet, the opposite of Ma'at, the elite and the powerful, spent their lives preparing for death. But this was not an act of fear, it was devotion. Pharaohs commissioned tombs the moment they ascended the throne, knowing their afterlife would reflect their care and preparation in this world. Skilled artisans in villages like Deir el-Medina worked for decades on intricate tomb paintings and carvings, illustrating the journey from death to paradise. Every brushstroke, every hieroglyph was an act of faith. Even the poorest Egyptians dreamed of an afterlife, though their means were humble. Instead of gold sarcophagi, they used simple wooden coffins or reed mats. They couldn't afford elaborate tombs, but they placed amulets on their bodies, symbols of protection such as the Ankh for life or the Eye of Horus for safety. They were buried with small figurines called ushabtis, tiny servants meant to perform labor for them in the field of reeds. No one, whether a peasant or a pharaoh, wished to enter eternity alone. When we step into an Egyptian tomb today, we step into their eternal vision. The walls burst with color even after thousands of years, reds, blues, and golds depicting rivers, crops, animals, and gods. These were not mere decorations. They were spells of power designed to bring those images to life in the afterworld. The hieroglyphs alongside them were not just text, but sacred speech, words that could awaken magic when read aloud. For example, one spell from the Book of the Dead reads, "I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused pain to another." This declaration was a moral passport, a confession of purity before judgment. Each line was a plea to the gods, proving the soul had lived by Ma'at. The Egyptians believed that one could not fake virtue in death. The gods would see the truth within the heart. But beyond all ritual and religion, what makes this culture so hauntingly human is how it reveals our shared longing, the need to be remembered. The ancient Egyptians built in stone so their names would never fade, yet they also built in story. In the quiet tombs of Thebes or the sands of Saqqara, their voices still echo through inscriptions. Say my name, so I may live again. This connection between memory and immortality is perhaps their most profound idea. To them, forgetting was a form of death. To speak someone's name was to restore them, even across centuries. When modern visitors read aloud the name of a long-dead scribe, in that moment, they fulfill an Egyptian prayer whispered 3,000 years ago, to be remembered, to live again through the breath of others. The deeper you dive into these beliefs, the more you realize that the Egyptians weren't obsessed with death. They were devoted to life. Every ritual, every offering, every tomb was a promise that life could transcend its limits. Death wasn't something to be feared. It was a gateway guarded by gods, illuminated by truth, and rewarded with eternity. Even their gods reflected this duality of life and death. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, was also the god of fertility and rebirth. His myth told of his death, dismemberment, and resurrection, symbolizing the cycle of decay and renewal in nature. When the Nile flooded each year, bringing fertile soil to barren land, it was said that Osiris's spirit was rising again. To live and die in harmony with that rhythm was to live rightly. At night, the people would look up at the stars, believing them to be the souls of the righteous dead who had joined the sun god in the heavens. The Milky Way itself was seen as a divine river mirroring the Nile in the sky. The heavens and the earth were not separate worlds, but reflections of one another, bound by the same divine laws, and in that belief lies the timeless wisdom of the Egyptians, that life and death are not enemies, but companions. They believed that to prepare for death was to honor life itself, to live so well that even eternity would welcome you. And so, from the grandeur of the pyramids to the quiet of the smallest desert tomb, the same message whispers through time. All that is loved, all that is good, will rise again with the dawn. The gods of ancient Egypt were more than just figures of worship. They were woven into every aspect of daily life, shaping how people worked, dreamed, and even died. To the Egyptians, the divine wasn't distant or abstract. It lived beside them, within them, and through them. Their pantheon of gods reflected the natural world around them. The flooding of the Nile, the scorching heat of the sun, the growth of crops, and the mystery of the night sky. Each god had a role, and every role told part of the story of life and death. Osiris stood at the heart of this belief system. Known as the god of the afterlife and resurrection, he was once a great king said to have ruled Egypt in peace before being betrayed by his jealous brother. Set murdered Osiris, dismembered his body, and scattered the pieces across Egypt. His wife Isis, in an act of devotion and love, traveled the land to gather his remains and, through divine magic, restored him to life. Their union gave birth to Horus, the falcon-headed god who would later avenge his father and restore order to the world. This myth wasn't just a story. It was the spiritual blueprint of Egyptian life. The death and resurrection of Osiris symbolized the cycle of decay and renewal seen in the fields every year. Just as the Nile's floodwaters brought new life to the soil, so too did Osiris's rebirth promise eternal life to the faithful. Every Egyptian, rich or poor, saw themselves as a reflection of Osiris, believing that through righteousness and ritual, they too could rise again after death. In temples across the land, priests reenacted this sacred drama. During the annual Mysteries of Osiris festival, they carried effigies of the god through the streets, wrapped in linen like mummies, then placed them in the ground to symbolize burial and rebirth. Ordinary people would plant seeds at the same time, believing their growth represented Osiris's return. The connection between agriculture and divinity was profound. Life was not only sustained by the earth, but sanctified by it. While Osiris ruled over the afterlife, other gods guided souls along the journey. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, watched over the process of mummification and guarded the tombs from desecration. His sleek black figure, symbolizing both death and regeneration, was painted on the walls of burial chambers. In funerary scenes, Anubis is often shown gently guiding the deceased spirit toward the Hall of Judgment, where the heart would be weighed. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, stood beside the scales, recording the outcome. If the heart balanced against the feather of Ma, the symbol of truth and order, the soul was declared pure. If it was heavier, burdened by sin or deceit, the soul was devoured by Amit, a terrifying creature part lion, crocodile, and hippopotamus. This was not eternal torment, but annihilation. The worst fate imaginable to an Egyptian, to cease existing, to be forgotten. The emphasis on truth, balance, and moral integrity made Egyptian religion as much a philosophy as it was a faith. People weren't simply told to obey, they were encouraged to live in harmony with cosmic order. The concept of Maat wasn't enforced by priests alone, it was taught in every household. Parents told their children to speak truth, do justice, give bread to the hungry, and respect the gods, not just to please divine powers, but to maintain the balance that held the world together. In daily life, offerings to the gods were made with the same care and respect as royal ceremonies. A farmer might leave bread at a small shrine to thank the gods for a good harvest. A fisherman might pour a libation of water into the Nile before casting his net. Every act of devotion, no matter how small, was part of the great exchange between humans and the divine, giving in order to receive, honoring in order to be protected. Inside the temples, however, the rituals were complex and magnificent. Only the high priests and the pharaoh were permitted to enter the inner sanctuaries, where the sacred statues of the gods resided. These statues were not mere symbols. They were thought to be vessels for the gods themselves. Every morning, priests would perform the opening of the mouth ritual to awaken the divine essence within them. They washed the statue, anointed it with oils, dressed it in fine linen, and presented offerings of food and incense. To the Egyptians, this wasn't idol worship, it was communion. The god's spirit was alive in that space, and through these rituals, harmony was maintained between heaven and earth. At night, the priests would close the temple doors, sealing the divine presence within. The temple itself was designed as a reflection of the universe, from the massive pylons representing the horizon to the dark inner chamber, symbolizing the primeval mound from which creation began. Even the ceilings were painted with stars to remind the worshippers that they were standing between the worlds of gods and men. The pharaoh was seen as the ultimate bridge between those worlds. He wasn't simply a ruler, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the divine protector of Egypt. His every action, from leading military campaigns to performing rituals, was meant to uphold Maat. When a pharaoh died, he was believed to become one with Osiris, joining the gods in the afterlife and ensuring the continued prosperity of the land. This is why the construction of royal tombs, and especially the pyramids, was of such great importance. They were not monuments to power, they were engines of resurrection. Even ordinary Egyptians mirrored this divine order in their own funerary practices. Though they couldn't afford the grandeur of royal tombs, they tried to replicate the essential elements: proper burial rites, offerings, and a journey through the afterlife. Many were buried with copies of the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and prayers that acted as a spiritual guidebook. These texts described how to navigate the dangers of the underworld, the dark waters, the serpent demons, and the gates guarded by fearsome deities, until the soul reached the field of reeds, the paradise where the blessed lived eternally in peace. The field of reeds wasn't an abstract heaven. It was a perfect version of Egypt itself. The Nile flowed gently, crops grew without end, and families were reunited. People worked the fields, ate, sang, and rejoiced, not as laborers, but as eternal souls in harmony. Everything they had loved in life continued in death, purified and everlasting. For the Egyptians, this was not fantasy. It was a moral promise. A good life led to a good death, and a good death led to eternal peace. It's why they preserved the body with such care, believing that the soul, or ka, needed a physical vessel to recognize and inhabit. The preservation of the body ensured the soul's stability, just as the recitation of spells ensured its safe passage. Today, when we walk through the tombs of the Valley of the Kings or stand before the golden mask of Tutankhamun, we are not merely witnessing artifacts. We are standing in the presence of a civilization's deepest hope that the essence of who we are does not vanish when the heart stops beating. The Egyptians believed that death was only the middle chapter of existence. The journey didn't end in the tomb. It began there. Through the trials of the underworld, the soul emerged purified, ready to join the divine order of the cosmos. To them, eternity wasn't a distant dream. It was the ultimate continuation of the life they loved so dearly. And so, they built, prayed, and lived in preparation for that eternal dawn, confident that when the last breath left their bodies, they would awaken to a new light, guided by the gods they had served and the truth they had lived by. As the final breath left the body and the heart fell still, the ancient Egyptians believed that the soul began a long and perilous journey into the unseen. Death was not the end, but a passage, the beginning of a voyage that tested the spirit's worth. The newly departed soul, known as the Ba, separated from the body but never fully left it. It could take flight in the form of a bird with a human head, soaring between the land of the living and the world of the dead, visiting loved ones or watching over the tomb where the body rested. Yet the Ba could not rest in peace until it reached the afterlife and reunited with its Ka, the life force essence that sustained it. This reunion could only occur if the deceased succeeded in navigating the labyrinthine underworld, the Duat. It was a place of mystery and terror, described as both a realm of shadows and light, filled with gods, monsters, and rivers of fire. For the Egyptians, the Duat mirrored the night sky through which the sun god Ra traveled each evening. Just as Ra fought his way through darkness to rise again at dawn, so too did the soul fight to be reborn into eternal life. The journey through the Duat was no simple stroll. It was a trial of courage, wisdom, and purity. The soul had to pass through 12 gates, each guarded by fearsome deities with strange and hybrid forms, crocodile-headed sentinels, serpent demons, and lion-bodied judges. Each gate demanded the correct spell or password, knowledge of which was provided by the sacred texts buried with the dead, most famously, the Book of the Dead. Without these words of power, the soul risked being lost forever in the shadows. The first test came at the River of Night. Here, the soul encountered ferrymen who would not grant passage without knowing the true names of the gods. To the Egyptians, names held immense power. To know a god's name was to hold a piece of their essence. Those who had lived honorable lives and had studied the sacred teachings could speak these names and earn safe passage. Those who could not were turned away, left to wander the banks of eternity. Deeper within the Duat, the soul faced the lake of fire, a burning expanse that devoured the impure. But for the righteous, this lake offered purification, not punishment. Passing through it symbolized shedding the last remnants of mortal weakness, an act of transformation. Fire did not destroy the good, it cleansed them for the trials to come. One of the most dreaded encounters awaited near the fifth gate, the serpent Apep, the embodiment of chaos. Apep sought to devour both the souls of the dead and the sun god Ra himself as he journeyed through the night. To defeat Apep, the soul had to call upon the god's protection, reciting the correct incantations with unshakable faith. The struggle between order and chaos wasn't just the god's war. It was mirrored in every individual's journey. To survive Apep's assault meant proving one's alignment with Mahat, the eternal balance of truth and order. Once past, the chaos, the soul, approached the most solemn moment of all, the Hall of Two Truths. It was here that judgment awaited. The hall was vast and illuminated by a celestial glow, its walls inscribed with stars and divine symbols. Seated on a throne of gold and emerald sat Osiris, the god of the afterlife, wearing his white crown and holding the crook and flail. Around him stood the 42 assessors of Ma'at, divine judges representing every principle of morality. Each one demanded that the soul declare innocence from a particular sin. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not spoken lies, I have not defiled myself. These confessions formed the famous negative confessions, a spiritual code far older than any written law. At the center of the hall stood the great scales of truth. Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian, carefully placed the heart of the deceased on one side of the balance, and on the other, the feather of Ma'at. The heart, believed to contain the record of every thought and deed, could not be deceived. It would weigh only as light or as heavy as one's life truly had been. Nearby stood Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, recording every detail of the outcome in his scrolls. Silence filled the chamber as the scales wavered. If the heart was pure and balanced with the feather, a radiant light would fill the hall. The soul had passed. But if the heart was heavy with deceit, it would tip the scales, sealing the spirit's doom. In an instant, Amit, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, would lunge forward and consume the heart. For that soul, there was no afterlife, no rebirth, only the eternal void of non-existence. For those who passed, the trial, the journey continued into paradise, the field of reeds. It was a mirror image of Egypt itself, only perfect in every way. The Nile flowed endlessly through lush fields of grain. The air was cool, the skies golden with light. Families were reunited, homes restored, and work became joy. The blessed souls would spend eternity tending crops that never withered, living under the watchful eyes of Osiris and the gods. The afterlife was not a reward for wealth or power. It was the rightful destination for those who had lived truthfully, upheld kindness, and respected the cosmic order. But even in paradise, ritual and reverence continued. Souls would still make offerings to the gods, honor the sun's daily rebirth, and sing hymns to Osiris. Eternity was not idleness. It was harmony, the eternal maintenance of Ma. To the Egyptians, this balance between life, death, and rebirth was sacred. The same order that governed the stars above and the floods of the Nile also governed the fate of every soul. Perhaps what made Egyptian belief so enduring was their refusal to see death as an end or a punishment. Death was a transition, a continuation of the natural cycles they saw every day. The setting sun promised dawn, the dying crops promised growth, and the silence of the tomb promised awakening. The people who built the pyramids and carved the hieroglyphs did not fear death as we do today. They prepared for it, honored it, and accepted it as a divine truth, the bridge between the mortal and the eternal. Every coffin, every amulet, every spell painted on the wall of a tomb carried the same message: you will live again. The golden scarabs placed over the heart whispered it in the darkness, the priests chanted it during the burial rites, and the stars themselves seemed to echo it across the desert night. And so for thousands of years, through sandstorms, conquests, and time itself, that belief endured. The Egyptians built their civilization upon the promise of immortality, and in doing so, they achieved it. For though their kings have turned to dust and their temples have fallen, their names, their stories, and their vision of eternity still live on. The ancient Egyptians didn't merely ask what happens after death. They answered it with art, with faith, and with an unshakable conviction that life, in all its beauty and struggle, never truly ends. The belief in an eternal life after death did more than comfort the Egyptians. It shaped every detail of their civilization. Their art, architecture, rituals, and even politics were bound to the conviction that the soul's journey never ended. To them, the living world was only a brief chapter in a far longer story. Every action, every offering, and every word spoken in the temples was written with the afterlife in mind. The preparation for death began long before a person's final breath. Egyptians saw life as a sacred opportunity to ready themselves for eternity. From the pharaoh to the farmer, everyone sought to live according to Ma'at, truth, justice, balance, because to live without it was to risk eternal destruction. Those who held power, however, took this preparation to monumental levels. The grand tombs and pyramids that still rise from the desert were not built out of vanity alone. They were gateways to the afterlife. The earliest tombs, known as mastabas, were simple rectangular structures made of mud brick, often with a burial chamber below ground and a small chapel above for offerings. These evolved over centuries into the magnificent pyramids we know today, most famously, the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza. But beyond their size and splendor, pyramids were spiritual machines carefully aligned with the stars. The ancient architects designed passageways that pointed toward specific constellations associated with eternity, especially Orion and the imperishable northern stars, which the Egyptians believed never set. To them, these celestial bodies symbolized the immortality of the pharaoh's soul. Inside these tombs, everything served a sacred purpose. The walls were carved and painted with images of the deceased's daily life, hunting, fishing, feasting, not as memories, but as spells. The Egyptians believed that by depicting these scenes, they could magically bring them to life in the afterworld. A painted loaf of bread could become a real one in eternity. A carved servant could rise and labor for their master forever. Every stroke of the brush, every chisel mark was an act of faith. The objects buried within the tomb also reflected this spiritual practicality. Furniture, jewelry, cosmetics, games, weapons, even pets, all were provided to ensure the deceased could live comfortably beyond death. But perhaps the most mysterious of all were the Shabti figures, small statues placed in the tomb to serve the dead in the afterlife. Inscribed with spells they would awaken when called upon, saying, "Here I am, I will do it." To the Egyptians, the afterlife was not a ghostly paradise. It was a continuation of life's duties and joys, only perfected and eternal. But the heart of this eternal preparation lay in one practice above all others: mummification. Preserving the body was essential, for the Egyptians believed that the Ka, the life force, needed a physical form to return to. If the body decayed, the soul would be lost forever. Thus began one of the most intricate and spiritual forms of preservation ever devised. The process lasted around 70 days. First, the embalmers carefully removed the internal organs, each of which was separately treated and placed into canopic jars, one for the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines, protected by the 4 sons of Horus. The heart, however, was left inside the body, for it was believed to contain the essence of the person's soul and memory. The brain, thought to serve little purpose, was removed through the nose using a hooked instrument. Next came purification. The body was washed in sacred water and anointed with oils and resin. Then it was packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt, to dry it completely. After 40 days, the body was emptied of the natron, stuffed with linen and spices, and finally wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips. Each layer was coated with resin to seal it, and amulets were placed among the wrappings to offer protection, most notably the scarab placed over the heart to guard against judgment. As the embalmers worked, priests recited spells to awaken divine protection. When the final layers of linen were secured, the mummy was placed within a series of coffins, often 3 or 4 nested together, each painted with spells and images of gods. The outermost coffin, the sarcophagus, was a masterpiece of art and devotion, inscribed with the deceased's name and titles, ensuring their identity would never be forgotten. The burial ceremony itself was a profound event. It began with the opening of the mouth ritual, a sacred act that symbolically restored the mummy's senses. A priest, often wearing a jackal mask in honor of Anubis, would touch the mummy's mouth and eyes with a special tool, declaring that they could once again speak, see, and breathe in the afterlife. This moment marked the rebirth of the soul. The procession to the tomb was solemn and elaborate. Family members and mourners followed the coffin, wailing in grief but also in reverence. Women played the role of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, sisters of Osiris, mourning his death and celebrating his resurrection, symbolizing the deceased's passage to immortality. Offerings of food, incense, and flowers were placed at the tomb entrance, while priests recited prayers to guide the spirit on its journey. Once the coffin was placed within the tomb, the entrance was sealed, often with heavy stones and protective curses. The tomb was never meant to be reopened. It was a sacred threshold between worlds. For the living, the burial marked an end. For the soul, it marked a beginning. Even after burial, the connection between the living and the dead did not end. Families returned regularly to offer food, drink, and incense at the tomb's chapel. They believed that the ka of the deceased could consume the spiritual essence of these offerings. Neglecting this duty was unthinkable. It would mean starving the soul. This constant cycle of remembrance ensured that the dead remained part of the living world, just as the living remained part of eternity. These rituals and beliefs were not reserved for kings alone. Over time, ordinary Egyptians also embraced the hope of an afterlife. Though they could not afford grand pyramids, they built modest tombs, painted scenes of joy on their walls, and commissioned their own books of the dead. The democratization of eternity reflected a remarkable idea that eternal life was not a privilege of birth, but a reward of virtue. As centuries passed, however, Egypt's ancient faith began to shift. Foreign invaders, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, brought their own gods and philosophies, yet the essence of Egypt's afterlife beliefs endured, subtly blending with new ideas. When Christianity took root in Egypt, its vision of resurrection and eternal life found deep resonance with the old traditions. The tombs, the prayers, the hope for a life beyond death, all found echoes in new forms. In modern times, the rediscovery of these tombs reawakened the world's fascination with death and eternity. When archaeologists uncovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, they found not only unimaginable treasures, but also a glimpse into the ancient heart of humanity's oldest question. What happens after we die? The walls of his tomb, still bright with color after 3,000 years, depicted the young king's journey through the underworld, the same tests, gods, and promises described in sacred texts. The discovery was more than historical, it was spiritual. It reminded the modern world that thousands of years ago, a civilization had already wrestled with the mysteries of mortality and found comfort in the belief that death was not an ending, but a continuation. Even today, as we walk through museums and gaze at the golden masks, the linen-wrapped mummies and the faded hieroglyphs, we can sense the same quiet faith that guided the ancient Egyptians. They did not see the tomb as a prison, but as a vessel of rebirth. Their gods were not symbols of fear, but guardians of passage. And their vision of eternity was not an abstract dream, but a vivid and ordered reality, crafted with the same care they gave to life itself. The sands of time have buried their temples and silenced their prayers, but the essence of their belief remains. It whispers through every artifact, every inscription, every silent sarcophagus. Life never truly dies, it transforms. The Egyptians may have been obsessed with death, but in truth, they were celebrating life in its most enduring form. And so, thousands of years later, their promise still lingers beneath the desert stars, the promise that beyond this fragile world lies another, radiant and eternal, where the soul finds its way home. Centuries after the last pyramid was raised and the final hieroglyph carved, the mystery of the Egyptian afterlife still captivates us. The desert that once guarded the tombs of kings has become a stage for modern discovery. What the ancient Egyptians saw as a sacred journey, we now explore through archaeology, science, and imagination. But even with all our tools and technology, one truth remains. The Egyptian idea of death was far richer and more human than we ever expected. When Napoleon's army entered Egypt in the late 18th century, they brought not just soldiers but scholars. These men, scientists, artists, linguists, mapped and documented everything they found. What began as military conquest soon became an awakening of curiosity. The publication of Description de l'Égypte, a massive collection of drawings and notes, introduced Europe to the forgotten world of the pharaohs. People who had never seen a pyramid suddenly dreamed of sand-covered temples and mummified kings. Egypt became a symbol of mystery and eternal life. Then in 1822, a discovery changed everything. Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone, unlocking the hieroglyphic language after centuries of silence. For the first time since antiquity, the ancient Egyptians could speak again. Their beliefs, once buried beneath the sand, came alive in their own words. Spells, prayers, letters to the dead. These texts revealed not a culture obsessed with death, but one that viewed it as an essential part of life's great cycle. The more archaeologists uncovered, the clearer it became that the Egyptian afterlife was not a simple heaven or hell. It was a reflection of life itself, filled with work, family, and joy, but perfected. The dead continued to farm, eat, and play music. They sailed along the heavenly Nile, greeted by familiar gods who had walked with them in spirit during their lives. The Egyptians didn't long for escape. They longed for continuation. To them, eternity was not about leaving the world behind. It was about preserving everything they loved within it. This vision became vividly real again in 1922, when Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb was small compared to others, but untouched for over 3,000 years. When Carter peered through the doorway with his candle, he saw treasures glimmering in the darkness, chariots, golden statues, and a bed shaped like a lion. But beyond the wealth, what stunned the world was the intimacy of it. Everything in that tomb told the story of a boy who had once walked, dreamed, and hoped for eternity. The world's fascination exploded. Newspapers called it the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. People in London and New York lined up to see exhibitions of Tutankhamun's mask, believing they were staring into the face of a god. But what they were really seeing was the face of human longing, the same hope that had driven the Egyptians for millennia. And yet, as science advanced, it began to uncover truths that even the ancients could not have imagined. Modern technology, CT scans, DNA testing, and carbon dating revealed secrets hidden inside mummies for thousands of years. The dried flesh and linen wrappings that once seemed only symbolic turned out to be living archives of history. For example, scientists discovered that the mummification process was far more varied than once believed. Some mummies were preserved with exquisite care, each organ treated, each layer of wrapping done with precision, while others were rushed or incomplete, perhaps due to cost or time. This revealed something profound. Even in death, social class mattered. Eternal life, it seemed, could also depend on wealth. Studies of mummies also revealed diseases that still plague humanity today: arthritis, dental infections, and even cancer. Far from being divine beings untouched by pain, the ancient Egyptians suffered just as we do. The difference was that they faced mortality with reverence rather than fear. Their rituals were not an attempt to escape death, but to dignify it, to give it meaning. Modern excavations have also shown how ordinary people prepared for the afterlife. In the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, archaeologists found beautifully painted tombs belonging not to pharaohs, but to artisans, the very men who built the royal tombs. Their walls were decorated with hymns, prayers, and scenes of family gatherings. One tomb shows the owner drinking with his wife before the gods. Another shows musicians playing harps as the deceased enters paradise. Even those of modest means imagined an eternity filled with comfort, laughter, and companionship. Through these discoveries, we've learned that the Egyptians were not merely religious, they were artists of the soul. Every aspect of their civilization was shaped by the desire to make eternity beautiful. Their temples were architectural prayers. Their art was theology in color. Their hieroglyphs were both language and magic, meant not just to record, but to create, to make eternal whatever they described. And perhaps that's why their legacy has endured for over 4,000 years. Even as empires rose and fell, even as religions shifted and gods were forgotten, the Egyptian idea of immortality persisted. It found echoes in Greek philosophy, in Roman funerary art, and eventually in Christianity's vision of resurrection. When early Christians in Egypt, known as Copts, buried their dead, they continued to use many of the same symbols and rituals as their ancestors. The language had changed, but the message was the same. The soul lives on. In the 19th century, Egyptomania swept across Europe and America. The discovery of ancient tombs inspired artists, architects, and writers. The obelisks that now stand in Paris, London, and New York were carried across oceans to remind the modern world of its connection to the eternal. Even cemeteries began to reflect Egyptian influence. Stone sphinxes guarded graves, and pyramidal mausoleums rose among crosses and angels. The ancient Egyptian promise of life beyond death had transcended time, reshaping how humanity remembered its dead. But the fascination with mummies also took darker turns. In the Victorian era, mummy unwrapping parties became macabre social events. Wealthy guests would gather to watch as real ancient mummies were unwrapped, their amulets and linen stripped away for curiosity's sake. It was an act of both awe and ignorance, modern people trying to touch eternity, yet misunderstanding its sacredness. The Egyptians had wrapped their dead to protect them. Now, centuries later, others tore those wrappings away in the name of entertainment. Today, attitudes have changed. Archaeologists approach these remains with respect, understanding that they are not relics, but individuals, mothers, fathers, workers, priests, each with their own story. Museums around the world now strive to present Egypt's heritage not as spectacle, but as testimony. When you stand before a mummy in a glass case, you are not merely seeing the past, you are looking into a mirror of human faith. Science continues to peel back layers of mystery. Infrared imaging has revealed hidden paintings beneath tomb walls. DNA studies have reconstructed family trees of pharaohs. Artificial intelligence now helps read damaged papyri, restoring texts unseen for thousands of years. And yet, despite all this progress, one thing remains unchanged: the sense of wonder. Because at its heart, the story of the Egyptian afterlife is not about gods or gold, it's about us. It's about our refusal to accept that love and life end. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul could be weighed, judged, and renewed. We may not share their rituals, but we share their yearning to believe that something within us continues after our last breath. Their legacy teaches us that immortality is not found in escaping time, but in leaving something behind that time cannot destroy. The pyramids were one answer to that longing, massive monuments of stone and faith. But every written word, every kind act, every memory we leave in another's heart is also a kind of pyramid. Smaller perhaps, but built of the same hope. And as the sun sets over the Nile and the ancient tombs glow red in the fading light, it's easy to feel that connection. The same stars that watched over the builders of the pyramids still shine above us. The same winds that swept through the Valley of the Kings still whisper over the sand. The Egyptians were right in one sense. Nothing truly dies. Everything becomes part of the great cycle of memory, dust, and rebirth. In that eternal balance between life and death, we find the truest reflection of humanity, not in our fear of the end, but in our faith that there is something beyond it. Every image painted on a tomb wall in ancient Egypt had a voice, a purpose, and a prayer. These were not decorations meant to please the living, but messages meant to guide the dead. The Egyptians believed that art itself was alive, a medium through which the divine could be invoked. To paint a loaf of bread was not simply to depict food. It was to create it for the afterlife. To carve a boat on stone was to ensure that the deceased could sail the celestial Nile forever. When you step into an ancient tomb, whether in Saqqara or Thebes, you don't enter a place of despair. You enter a story told in colors and symbols. The walls are alive with scenes of harvests, music, banquets, and offerings. Servants bring food, wives play harps, children fish by the river. The dead are shown at peace, surrounded by the abundance they once knew. It was not mourning, but continuity. The afterlife was an eternal Egypt, perfect and unchanging, and yet every stroke of pigment carried layers of belief. The colors themselves held sacred meaning. Red symbolized vitality and the energy of life, but also danger and chaos. Green represented fertility, new growth, and resurrection. Gold was the flesh of the gods, eternal and incorruptible. Blue, drawn from lapis lazuli, was the color of the heavens and divine protection. In every shade, the Egyptians expressed a theology of rebirth and balance. The walls also reflected the moral code that governed their afterlife. In the center of many tombs, you'll find the weighing of the heart scene. Here, the deceased stands before Osiris, god of the underworld, while Anubis weighs their heart against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and justice. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul was pure and could pass into eternity. But if it was heavy with sin, it was devoured by Amit, a terrifying creature part lion, crocodile, and hippopotamus. This idea of moral judgment was revolutionary. Long before Christianity or Islam, the Egyptians believed that eternal life depended on one's behavior, not on birth or power. Pharaohs and peasants alike would face the same scale. What mattered was how truthfully they had lived, whether they had lied, stolen, or caused suffering. The negative confession carved into tomb texts reads like an ancient conscience. I have not committed murder. I have not cheated in the marketplace. I have not polluted the water. I have not cursed the gods. But the Egyptians didn't imagine this judgment as terrifying. To them, it was a necessary purification, the moment when the soul became light enough to rise into eternity. Even their gods reflected this balance. Osiris, though ruler of the dead, was a symbol of renewal, not destruction. His death and resurrection mirrored the flooding of the Nile, the cycle of decay and rebirth that sustained all life. Art historians often describe Egyptian tombs as machines for eternity. Every wall, every object, every line of hieroglyphs was part of a spiritual mechanism designed to maintain harmony between the mortal and divine. The sarcophagus was not a coffin. It was a protective cocoon. The mummified body was not meant to be lifeless. It was a vessel awaiting the soul's return. The statues placed near the body, the car statues, were alternate homes for the spirit in case the body was ever destroyed. Even the smallest offering bowl had cosmic importance. The more archaeologists uncovered these beliefs, the more they began to see how deeply integrated religion, art, and daily life were in Egypt. Unlike modern societies that often separate the sacred from the ordinary, the Egyptians lived in a world where everything was divine. The act of eating, the movement of the sun, the rhythm of the river, all were sacred cycles echoing the eternal order of Ma'at. This philosophy also shaped how Egyptians built their world. Their temples, for instance, were constructed as symbolic journeys from chaos to creation. You entered through massive pylons representing the horizon, moved through halls that symbolized the world of men, and ended in the Sanctum Sanctorum, the divine heart, where the god's statue resided. The architecture itself was a prayer in stone, an eternal repetition of the first moment of creation. Inside tombs, the same logic applied. The layout often mirrored the sun's path, symbolizing the journey from life to death and back to rebirth. The entrance, facing east, welcomed the morning light. The burial chamber, hidden deep within, represented the dark underworld. To walk through a tomb was to follow the same path the soul would take after death. This blending of spiritual and physical space gave Egyptian culture a profound sense of continuity. Life and death were not opposites. They were two halves of the same whole. And that's perhaps the greatest difference between their worldview and ours. Modern culture often treats death as an end, something to avoid or deny. The Egyptians, on the other hand, accepted it as transformation. Their writings in the Book of the Dead describe this transformation in poetic detail. The soul sails across celestial waters, guided by divine ferrymen. It passes through gates guarded by strange deities, each representing challenges to moral or spiritual truth. The deceased must recite passwords, hymns, and confessions, not as tests, but as affirmations of understanding. To know the names of the gods was to align oneself with the order of the cosmos. Knowledge was salvation. The journey culminates when the soul meets Osiris and joins the blessed dead in the field of reeds, a perfect reflection of Egypt itself. Fertile fields, calm waters, eternal sunlight. Here, the soul reunites with loved ones, works the land without toil, eats without hunger, and lives without end. It was an afterlife shaped by gratitude, not fear. Modern researchers have noted that this optimistic vision likely helped Egyptian civilization endure for so long. Their faith in cyclical renewal encouraged stability and resilience. Even during periods of famine or invasion, they believed that cosmic order would be restored. Each sunrise over the Nile was proof that life continued. Today, when we look at their monuments, we often see them as symbols of death. Tombs, mummies, relics of a vanished world. But to the Egyptians, they were the opposite, symbols of life's victory over decay. The pyramid, for instance, represented the rays of the sun, a staircase leading the pharaoh's soul toward the heavens. Its perfect geometry was not just architectural genius, but a reflection of cosmic harmony. What's astonishing is how this ancient vision continues to echo through time. In art, literature, and even modern spirituality, the Egyptian afterlife lives on. Writers from Shakespeare to Shelley to modern filmmakers have drawn from it. The idea of the soul's journey of moral balance, of death as transformation, all trace their roots to the Nile. Even today, phrases like weighing on my heart echo the same symbolism as the feather of Ma'at. Museums across the world now house fragments of these beliefs. A carved scarab, a gilded mask, a painted Shabti figurine, but taken together they form something far greater. The story of humanity's oldest dream, the dream of continuity. When visitors stand before the golden mask of Tutankhamun or gaze at the murals of Nefertari's tomb, what moves them isn't just the beauty of the art. It's the feeling of recognition. We see in those painted faces our own longing to be remembered, our own hope to leave something behind. The Egyptians may have spoken in hieroglyphs and lived thousands of years ago, but their hearts beat with the same rhythm as ours. The afterlife they imagined wasn't an escape from the world, but an eternal return to the best of it. The love of family, the joy of harvest, the peace of sunlight on water. In that sense, their vision wasn't just religious, it was profoundly human. It reminds us that what truly endures isn't wealth or power, but the stories, deeds, and kindnesses we leave behind. Their civilization has long since turned to dust, yet their voices still reach us through stone, papyrus, and sand. And maybe that's the greatest proof of all that they were right, that something of us can last forever. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt began not with kings or priests, but with explorers, scholars, and dreamers who wandered through the silent ruins of the desert, searching for voices buried beneath the sands. When Napoleon's army entered Egypt in 1798, they did not only bring soldiers but artists, scientists, and historians. These men recorded everything they saw. The temples, the pyramids, the inscriptions half buried by centuries of wind. Out of that expedition came the Description de l'Égypte, a massive work that reintroduced the Western world to one of humanity's oldest civilizations. But it was a single stone, a broken slab of basalt, discovered in a small town called Rosetta, that would change everything. The Rosetta Stone contained the same text written in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. For centuries, the meaning of hieroglyphs had been lost, their symbols dismissed as mere decoration. But in 1822, a young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion cracked the code. With that discovery, the ancient Egyptians began to speak again. For the first time in thousands of years, the world could read their prayers, their laws, their songs to the gods. It was as if a civilization had been resurrected from silence. What had once been myth became memory. What had been lost became alive again. Through the deciphered texts, scholars began to understand how Egyptians viewed existence, not as linear, but as an eternal cycle of birth, death, and renewal. The 19th century soon became an age of obsession. Europe and America fell in love with ancient Egypt. Archaeologists, adventurers, and treasure hunters flocked to the Nile Valley. Men like Flinders Petrie, Howard Carter, and Auguste Mariette uncovered entire worlds beneath the desert. Each tomb they opened told a story, not of death, but of devotion. And then in 1922 came the moment that would ignite global fascination forever: Howard Carter's discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. Hidden for over 3,000 years, it was the most perfectly preserved royal tomb ever found. When Carter opened the door and held his candle to the darkness, he saw wonderful things. Golden chariots, alabaster jars, jeweled daggers, and the shining mask of a boy king who had become immortal. The world was stunned. Newspapers called it the greatest archaeological discovery in history. Millions lined up to see the treasures when they toured abroad. Egyptomania spread across fashion, film, and architecture, from jewelry shaped like scarabs to cinema scenes filled with pyramids and pharaohs. But beneath the glamour, something deeper stirred. The story of Tutankhamun reminded people of something universal: the desire to endure, to be remembered, to matter beyond death. The fascination didn't stop with artifacts. As more tombs and texts were studied, the Egyptians' spiritual philosophy began to influence modern thought. Their belief that the heart was the seat of the soul found echoes in early psychology. Their ideas of cosmic balance inspired philosophers and mystics. Even their architecture influenced modern design. Massive, geometric, harmonious, the ancient ideal of balance between humanity and the cosmos became a quiet thread running through Western art and literature. Writers like Percy Bysshe Shelley captured this awe in poems like Ozymandias, where the fallen statue of a great king becomes a reflection on time and impermanence. Painters and novelists used Egyptian imagery to explore themes of rebirth and eternity. Even in the 20th century, as science advanced and faith waned, the allure of the Nile endured. Psychologists like Carl Jung studied Egyptian symbols as expressions of the collective unconscious, archetypes that represented the universal journey of the human spirit. The scarab, the sun disk, the serpent. These were no longer seen as mere icons of an ancient religion, but as mirrors of the mind. Egypt became not just a place in history, but a metaphor for transformation. Modern Egyptology also began to reveal something profound, that beneath the grandeur of temples and kings lay a civilization built on continuity. Farmers, scribes, potters, and builders all saw their work as part of a divine order. Even the act of planting a seed or carving a statue was sacred because it maintained the balance that held the universe together. This worldview stood in contrast to the chaos of industrial modernity, and perhaps that's why it fascinated so many. In the 20th century, the rediscovery of ancient Egypt reached new heights through technology. CT scans of mummies revealed secrets about their health, diet, and even emotions. DNA analysis began to trace royal bloodlines and family connections lost to time. The digital age, in a way, had resurrected the dead once again, not through faith, but through science. Virtual reconstructions of tombs allowed people around the world to step into chambers once meant only for kings. Every pixel, every recreated painting brought the ancient world closer to modern eyes. And yet, even with all our knowledge, a sense of mystery remains. Because what draws us to ancient Egypt isn't just what we can measure. It's what we can feel. That haunting stillness of the desert, the perfection of hieroglyphic lines. The way sunlight strikes the face of a temple that was built to align with the stars. That connection between heaven and earth, between the living and the dead, continues to inspire. Artists use it to reflect on mortality. Filmmakers use it to evoke wonder. Historians study it to understand how a civilization could endure for over 3 millennia. But perhaps the truest reason we remain fascinated is that Egypt reminds us of what it means to be human. Every generation, in some form, returns to the same question the Egyptians asked: what happens when we die? And every time we walk through their tombs or gaze at their relics, we see their answer. That death is not an ending, but a return to the order of the cosmos. Today, visitors to the Valley of the Kings or the Temple of Luxor often describe a strange sense of calm. Amid the sand and silence, they feel something timeless, as if the air itself carries the hum of eternity. That feeling, that wordless recognition, is exactly what the Egyptians sought to preserve. Their rituals, art, and architecture were all ways of capturing that sensation. The peace that comes from knowing that life is part of a cycle too vast to end. Modern scientists may not share their theology, but even they admit the power of legacy. The laws of physics tell us that energy never disappears, it only changes form. The Egyptians believed the same, that the soul too transformed, continuing its journey in another realm. In a way, their spiritual intuition mirrors the universe's physical truth. Their civilization may have faded, but the light of their ideas still burn. Every time someone lights a candle for the dead, speaks a loved one's name, or dreams of immortality through art or memory, They're echoing Egypt's most sacred principle, that to be remembered is to live again. And so, the story comes full circle. The Nile still flows, the pyramids still rise, and the names of their kings are still spoken thousands of years later. That was the goal of every tomb, every ritual, every offering, to keep the soul alive through time. Against all odds, it worked. The Egyptians achieved what they most desired, eternity. They taught us that immortality isn't about escaping death. It's about leaving something behind, a word, a monument, a story that endures after the body is gone. In that sense, they succeeded more completely than any civilization before or since. And when you think of it, every discovery, every tomb opened, every name deciphered is not an act of disturbance but of resurrection. We are, in our own way, keeping their story alive, helping them cross that final threshold into eternal memory. Perhaps that's why, standing before the golden mask of Tutankhamun or the towering statues of Abu Simbel, people often fall silent. It's not just awe, it's recognition. Because deep down we know that the Egyptians' greatest achievement wasn't the pyramids or the temples. It was the timeless reminder that death cannot silence the human spirit. In our modern world, where technology advances faster than thought and the stars are no longer gods but distant suns, it might seem that the beliefs of ancient Egypt have long since faded into myth, yet their echoes still shape how we think about death, memory, and what it means to be remembered. Their vision of the afterlife, though born in the shadow of pyramids, continues to ripple quietly through the centuries into our customs, our art, and even our daily lives. When we stand in a cemetery today and see names carved into stone, we are continuing a tradition older than history itself. The Egyptians believed a person could live again only if their name was remembered. Erase the name, and the soul faded from existence. That is why the hieroglyphic carvings inside tombs were so carefully made. Each word a promise that the deceased would never be forgotten. We may not believe in the same gods, but when we speak of leaving a legacy, we're echoing that same ancient hope, that something of us might endure beyond the grave. Even the way we treat the dead holds traces of Egypt. The practice of embalming, though now medicalized and clinical, was inspired by their pursuit of preservation. To them, the body was not a mere vessel. It was part of the soul's identity. In death, the Egyptians sought perfection, the removal of decay, the wrapping of the body in linens like a cocoon ready for rebirth. The modern mortuary, with its quiet rituals of preparation and care, is a distant reflection of that same reverence. Funerals themselves remain ritualized journeys. The solemn music, the procession, the words spoken over the body, all of it follows the same rhythm that once guided the pharaohs to their tombs. The Book of the Dead was not just a collection of prayers. It was a roadmap for transformation. Today, our eulogies and final farewells play a similar role. They help the living guide the dead toward peace, while also guiding the mourners toward acceptance. In the ancient world, the Egyptians imagined the afterlife as a mirror of life itself, a paradise of fields, rivers, and sunlight where the soul could farm, sing, and embrace loved ones once again. It was not a distant heaven, but a continuation of the familiar. That idea of death as transition rather than annihilation lingers still. We speak of loved ones going to a better place, of meeting again someday. Those phrases, now softened by time, come from the same yearning the Egyptians felt. That love, once created, cannot be destroyed. Their belief in cosmic balance, in art, also continues to shape our moral imagination. To live rightly, to act with truth and fairness, these were not just virtues but necessities for the Egyptian soul. A person's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Judgment. Only those whose hearts were light, unburdened by lies or cruelty, could enter the afterlife. The metaphor endures even now. We may no longer picture scales and feathers, but we still talk about carrying guilt or having a heavy heart. The language of morality itself carries the imprint of that ancient theology. Their influence goes further still. The very architecture of memory, the way civilizations build monuments to endure, springs from the Egyptian conviction that stone could defy time. The obelisks that stand in Rome, Paris, London, and Washington are not Roman inventions, but Egyptian symbols of the eternal link between earth and sky. Even skyscrapers reaching toward the heavens echo that vertical aspiration, the human desire to ascend, to leave a mark visible from afar. The ancient Egyptians also invented the first recorded form of the tomb autobiography. Inscribed in their burial chambers, these texts told who they were, what they achieved, and what they hoped for. Today, we continue that tradition in epitaphs, memoirs, even social media profiles. Small monuments of identity that persist after we're gone. We may no longer write in hieroglyphs, but our need to be remembered in words remains unchanged. In the spiritual realm, too, echoes of Egypt are everywhere. The Christian idea of resurrection, of a soul judged and reborn into eternal life, owes much to the Egyptian template. Early theologians who studied in Alexandria, one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning, absorbed its philosophies of the soul's immortality. Even the imagery of light and rebirth, so central to later faiths, draws from the journey of Ra, the sun god, who descended into darkness each night only to rise again in glory. Egypt's art, with its serene faces and unblinking eyes, continues to influence how we imagine eternity. The stillness of those statues, the perfect symmetry of their forms, suggests something beyond the mortal. A calm acceptance of the infinite. Artists across centuries have borrowed from that ideal. In the Renaissance, sculptors carved faces of saints and angels with the same tranquil balance. In modern times, even minimalist design of pure lines, geometric harmony, carries faint echoes of Egypt's aesthetic order. And yet, for all the grandeur of their beliefs, what made the Egyptians remarkable was not their obsession with death, but their love of life. The tombs, though built for the dead, are filled with scenes of music, dancing, feasts, and gardens. They believed that to be prepared for eternity, one must first savor existence. Every harvest, every song, every sunrise mattered because it was part of the eternal cycle. The way they lived was inseparable from the way they died, both expressions of gratitude for the gift of creation. In this, there lies a quiet wisdom. While modern life often pulls us toward distraction and haste, the Egyptians remind us to think in longer rhythms, to measure our days not in minutes, but in meaning. Their devotion to craft, their patience in building monuments that would outlast empires, speaks of a culture that understood permanence in a way we have forgotten. When archaeologists open a tomb and find a loaf of bread, a carved toy, or a painted amulet beside a mummy, it tells us something profoundly human. These people, thousands of years ago, loved, feared, hoped, and dreamed as we do. They wanted to be remembered not just as kings or queens, but as individuals, parents, friends, lovers. That continuity across such vast distances of time is perhaps the real miracle of Egypt. In the end, their story is not just about what happens after death, but about what we choose to do while alive. Every ritual they performed, every temple they raised, was an act of defiance against oblivion, a declaration that life, however brief, could achieve permanence through remembrance, and perhaps that is the true secret the ancient Egyptians left behind. Immortality is not found in gold or tombs, but in the stories that others tell about us. As long as someone remembers, we never truly die. The spirit endures, moving from one heart to another, one generation to the next. So when you gaze at the golden mask of a pharaoh or trace your fingers along a hieroglyph carved 4,000 years ago, remember this: You are part of the same human chain that they once imagined stretching through eternity. The river of memory still flows, carrying us all toward the same horizon. The sands of Egypt may shift, the temples may crumble, but their belief in the power of remembrance has outlasted every empire.
And in that belief lies a truth that speaks to us still. We are all writing our own book of the dead, not with spells and papyrus,
but with the lives we lead and the love we leave behind. In that sense, the ancient Egyptians were right all along.
Death is not the end.
It is only another beginning.